Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I had planned a solo camping trip for months. Work had been stressful, and I needed a break. The thought of being surrounded by nature, away from everything, seemed perfect. I picked a secluded spot in the woods, far from any main trails. It was peaceful and quiet, exactly what I needed. I set up my tent and got a fire going as the sun began to set. It was just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. After a while, I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up and saw a man walking towards my campsite. He was carrying a backpack and had a friendly smile. He introduced himself as Tom and said he was camping nearby. At first, Tom seemed nice enough. We chatted for a bit, sharing stories about past camping trips. He even helped me gather some more firewood. It felt good to have some company, and I didn't think much of it. As the night went on, we talked more. But then Tom started mentioning details about my life that I hadn't shared with him. He knew where I worked, the type of car I drove, even my dog's name. I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know all that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom just smiled and shrugged. Small world, I guess. It didn't feel right. My instincts were screaming at me, but I didn't want to show my fear. I decided to cut the conversation short and said I was going to bed. Tom lingered a bit before finally saying goodnight and walking away. I watched him disappear into the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I went into my tent, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside made me jump. I kept thinking about how Tom knew so much about me. It didn't make sense. I lay there, listening, until I heard footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I peeked out of my tent and saw Tom standing at the edge of my campsite, just watching. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on him. "Tom, what are you doing?" I demanded. He stepped back into the shadows, his face just out of the light. "Just making sure you're okay," he said, his voice calm. "It's a dangerous place out here." I didn't respond. I stayed in my tent, holding onto my flashlight like a lifeline. Tom eventually walked away, but I knew I couldn't stay there. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my things as quickly and quietly as I could. I started hiking back towards my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I tried to stay calm and keep moving, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. After what felt like hours, I finally reached my car. I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I saw Tom emerge from the woods, his friendly smile now gone. He walked towards my car, and I floored it, not looking back. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. How did he know so much about me? Why was he following me? I knew I had to report this, but I also knew that without any real evidence, it would be my word against his. When I got home, I called a friend and told them everything. They insisted I report it to the authorities, which I did. They took my statement but didn't seem too concerned. It was just a creepy encounter in the woods to them. But I knew it was more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that Tom was still out there, watching. I changed all my online privacy settings, made sure all my doors and windows were locked, and tried to go back to my normal life. Days turned into weeks, and I started to relax a bit. but every now and then, I'd see a glimpse of someone who looked like Tom, or get a feeling that I was being watched. It never went away completely. I haven't been camping since. I had planned the camping trip for weeks. Work had been exhausting, and I needed a break. Being out in nature always helped me clear my head. I chose a remote spot in the forest, away from the usual campsites, to really disconnect. I arrived late afternoon, set up my tent, and got a fire going. It was peaceful, just the sounds of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. As the sun started to set, I took a walk around my campsite. I noticed some footprints nearby. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too big. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a hiker passing through earlier. I went back to my fire, made some dinner, and tried to relax. But the footprints kept nagging at me. I decided to go to bed early. As I was getting into my tent, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved quickly between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I stared into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I convinced myself it was just an animal and crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. My heart was pounding as I listened carefully. It sounded like footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, shining the light outside. There was no one there. I stepped out, looking around the campsite. Everything seemed normal, except for a few items that had been moved. My water bottle was on the other side of the fire pit, and my backpack was unzipped. Panic started to set in. Someone had been here, watching me. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the fire, keeping it going until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my things. I didn't want to be there any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I was packing up, I found more footprints around my tent. They were fresh. Someone had definitely been here during the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly finished packing and started the hike back to my car. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt oppressive and menacing. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to stay calm and keep moving, but my mind was racing. Who had been watching me? And why? When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. As I drove, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. I drove straight home and locked myself in. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked all the locks on my doors and windows, pulled the curtains closed, and tried to calm down. But every little noise made me jump. I knew I should call the police, but what could I tell them? That I felt like I was being watched in the woods? Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I stayed inside as much as possible, avoiding going out alone. I felt paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. It sounded crazy, even to me. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my window. My heart started racing. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure standing in my yard, watching my house. I froze, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police. Confront them? I decided to call the police. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. I told them someone was outside my house, watching me. They said they would send someone over. I hung up and kept watching the figure outside. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they did, the figure was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. They told me to call if anything else happened and left. I felt a little safer, but the fear didn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching, waiting. But the figure didn't return. The next day, I installed security cameras around my house. I couldn't live like this, constantly in fear. The cameras helped a little, but I still felt on edge. A week passed without any incidents. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was over. But then I found a note in my mailbox. It was simple, just a piece of paper with the words "I'm watching you" written on it. My heart sank. It wasn't over. I called the police again, showed them the note. They said they would increase patrols in my area, but there wasn't much else they could do. I felt helpless, constantly on edge. I started carrying a knife with me, just in case. Another week passed, and then another. No more notes, no more sightings. I started to think maybe it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed inside as much as possible, avoiding going out alone. My life had changed, and I didn't know if it would ever go back to normal. Months passed, and slowly, the fear started to fade. I still felt uneasy, but I started going out more, trying to reclaim my life. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Ben and I decided to get away from the city, away from the noise and stress. We found a secluded campsite online, surrounded by thick woods and far from any town. It sounded perfect. We packed our gear, food, and supplies, and set off late Friday afternoon. We arrived just before dark, setting up our tent while the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and distant calls of night birds. We started a fire and sat close, enjoying the crackling flames and the serenity of the place. After dinner, I noticed a glint of light in the bushes near our tent. I thought it was a firefly at first, but it didn't move. I walked over and found a small, black device half buried in the dirt. It was a camera, tiny and nearly invisible in the dark. I showed it to Ben, and we both felt a chill run down our spines. Who would put a camera out here? Ben wondered aloud. We looked around, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of our fire. We decided to keep the camera, thinking it might be from another camper who lost it or some weird prank. The next morning, we woke up early to explore the area. We hiked through the woods, following a narrow trail that wound past a bubbling creek and into a dense thicket. The air was fresh, and for a while, we forgot about the camera. When we returned to the campsite, we found another camera, this one attached to a tree overlooking our tent. It was positioned perfectly to capture everything we did. Panic set in. This wasn't a prank. Someone was watching us. We started searching the area methodically, and we found 2 more cameras, one hidden in the branches of a tree near our fire pit and another under a pile of leaves. The realization that someone had been close enough to plant these cameras made my skin crawl. Ben suggested we leave immediately, but our car was a 2-hour hike away, and it was already late afternoon. We decided to pack up and move to a different spot, hoping to find a place off the beaten path where we could be safe for the night. We hiked deeper into the woods, finding a small clearing far from the original campsite. We set up our tent quickly and built a small fire. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes set us on edge. Night fell, and the darkness seemed even more oppressive than before. We didn't sleep much, taking turns keeping watch. The feeling of being watched was constant, like a weight pressing down on us. In the early hours of the morning, I heard footsteps approaching. I woke Ben, and we listened in silence, holding our breath. The footsteps stopped just outside our tent. We could see shadows moving in the faint light of the dying fire. Someone was there, just inches away from us. Ben grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside. The beam of light revealed a man, dressed in dark clothes, holding a camera. His face was obscured by a hood. "Get out of here!" Ben shouted, his voice shaking. The man didn't move at first, then he turned and disappeared into the woods. We waited, hearts pounding, until we were sure he was gone. As soon as daylight broke, we packed up and headed for the car, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. Every snap of a branch made us jump, and we constantly looked over our shoulders. When we finally reached the car, we found it had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the windows were broken. We were stranded. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. We were miles from the nearest town. We decided to start walking, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a dirt road. We followed it, and eventually, we saw a small farmhouse in the distance. The farmer who lived there was kind enough to help us. He let us use his phone to call the police and arranged for a tow truck to get our car. The police took our statements and collected the cameras we had found. We never found out who the man was or why he was watching us. The police said they would investigate, but we never heard anything more. I decided to go camping to clear my head. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed some time away. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites. It was quiet, with just the sounds of nature around. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. The night was cool, and I felt at peace. As I sat by the fire, I heard footsteps. I looked up and saw a man approaching. He wore a ranger's uniform and had a friendly smile. He introduced himself as Mike, a park ranger. He asked if everything was all right and if I needed anything. At first, I was relieved to see him. It was nice knowing there was someone else out here. We chatted for a while. He asked a lot of questions, where I was from, how long I planned to stay, if I was alone. His questions started to feel intrusive. I tried to steer the conversation away from myself, but he kept bringing it back. His smile never reached his eyes, and I felt a growing unease. Mike started asking if I had seen anyone else around. He said there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area. His tone changed, becoming more serious. He wanted to know if I had a phone or any way to call for help if needed. I told him I did, but it was in my tent. He seemed too interested in that detail. I decided it was time to end the conversation. I thanked him for checking in and said I needed to get some rest. His smile faded and his eyes narrowed. He said he would be nearby if I needed anything and walked off into the woods. I watched him until he was out of sight, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I double-checked my tent and made sure my phone was charged. I kept the fire going, its light and warmth making me feel a bit safer. But the night was long, and every rustle in the trees made me jump. Hours passed, and I finally started to doze off when I heard footsteps again. I sat up, listening. The steps were slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure, Mike. He stepped into the light, his face serious. He said he had seen someone near my camp and wanted to make sure I was okay. But something in his tone felt off, like he was trying to gauge my reaction. I nodded, trying to keep calm, and thanked him again. He didn't leave right away. He stood there, watching me, and then asked if he could sit by the fire for a bit. I didn't want to be rude, but every instinct told me to say no. I told him I was really tired and needed to sleep. He finally nodded and walked away, but not before giving me a strange look. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing noises, real or imagined, and couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When morning finally came, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I wanted to get out of there before Mike came back. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car. Relief washed over me as I unlocked it and threw my gear inside. Just as I was about to get in, I heard a voice behind me. It was Mike. He asked if I was leaving already and why I seemed in such a hurry. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I told him I had an emergency back home and needed to leave. He stepped closer, too close, and said he hoped to see me back here soon. His smile was back, but his eyes were cold. I mumbled a quick goodbye and got into my car, locking the doors. As I drove away, I saw him in my rearview mirror, watching me. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Mike and his strange behavior. Once I got home, I called the park service and asked about him. They told me there was no ranger named Mike assigned to that area. My blood ran cold. I reported the encounter to the authorities, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. The experience left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. For weeks, I felt paranoid and uneasy. Every time I saw a ranger's uniform, my heart skipped a beat. I avoided going out alone and stayed away from remote areas. The woods, which had always been a place of peace for me, now felt threatening. Months passed, and I slowly started to feel normal again. But the memory of that night stayed with me. I realized how vulnerable I had been, alone in the woods with a stranger. It made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I'll never forget the look in Mike's eyes or the way his smile didn't match his words. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Mike and I, along with a few friends, decided to go camping in a secluded spot by the lake. The drive out there was peaceful, with the sun setting behind us and the air cooling down. We arrived at the campsite just as it got dark, setting up our tents and getting a fire going. The first night was uneventful. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, the stars bright above us. There were a few other campers nearby, but not too close. One group, in particular, caught our attention. They seemed to be watching us, but we brushed it off, thinking we were just being paranoid. The next day, we spent our time hiking and swimming in the lake. The group of campers from the night before waved at us a few times, but they didn't seem threatening, just a bit too interested in what we were doing. As evening approached, we cooked dinner and settled in for another night around the fire. It was around midnight when we noticed that Dave, one of our friends, was missing. We figured he might have gone for a walk or to use the bathroom, but as time passed, we started to worry. We called out for him, but there was no response. We searched the area around our campsite but found no sign of him. I couldn't shake the feeling that the nearby campers had something to do with it. They had been too interested in us, watching us more than normal. I mentioned this to Mike and the others, and we decided to check their campsite. When we got there, it was eerily quiet. Their fire was out, and there was no sign of anyone. We found Dave's flashlight near their site, which only made us more suspicious. We called the police, explaining the situation and our concerns about the other campers. They said they would send someone out, but it would take a while due to our remote location. While we waited, we stayed close together, keeping the fire burning bright. Every sound in the woods put us on edge. Finally, we saw flashlights and heard voices. The police had arrived. We explained everything again, and they started searching the area. They found the other campers about a mile away, hiding in the woods. When questioned, they denied knowing anything about Dave, but the police found a small clearing where they had set up another camp. There, hidden under some brush, was Dave, unconscious but alive. He had been hit over the head and tied up, left there while they decided what to do next. The police arrested the campers and took statements from all of us. Dave was taken to the hospital, where he was treated for a concussion. He didn't remember much, just that he was hit from behind while walking back to our campsite. We packed up the next morning, still shaken by what had happened. The peaceful getaway we had planned turned into a nightmare. The drive back to the city was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The experience changed us. We were more cautious, more aware of our surroundings. The thought that people could do something like that for no apparent reason was terrifying. It took a while for us to feel safe again, and we never went camping in a remote location after that. I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my mind. I found a secluded spot in the woods, far from any established campsite. The peace and quiet were just what I needed. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made myself comfortable. As the sun began to set, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I wandered through the trees, enjoying the solitude. After a while, I stumbled upon an old, isolated cabin. It looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds and broken windows. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, and there was a faint smell of decay. The cabin was small, with a single room filled with old, dusty furniture. I noticed a makeshift bed in the corner, which looked recently used. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been living here. I started to back out when something on the table caught my eye. It was a notebook, filled with scribbled notes and drawings. As I flipped through the pages, I realized they were all about me. There were sketches of my campsite, notes about my activities, and even details about my appearance. Panic set in. I dropped the notebook and ran out of the cabin. My mind raced as I made my way back to my campsite. Someone had been watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. I needed to leave, but it was getting dark, and I was deep in the woods. I reached my campsite and quickly started packing up my things. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I kept looking around, feeling like someone was watching me. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around and saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, with wild eyes. He was watching me with an unsettling intensity. I tried to stay calm and asked him what he wanted. He didn't answer, just took a step closer. I backed away, but he kept advancing. I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack and started to run, but he was fast, much faster than I expected. He tackled me to the ground, and we struggled. I managed to break free and sprinted into the woods. My heart was racing, and my breaths were ragged. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I had to find a way to lose him. I spotted a dense thicket and dove into it, hoping to hide. I crouched down, trying to control my breathing. I could hear him nearby, searching. I stayed as still as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps grew fainter, and I dared to move. I slowly made my way back to the trail, keeping an eye out for any sign of him. It was pitch black now, and I could barely see. I used my flashlight sparingly, not wanting to draw attention to myself. Every sound made me jump, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Finally, I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I managed to unlock the door and got in, locking it behind me. I started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. As I drove, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Someone had been living in that cabin, watching me, planning something. I couldn't believe how close I had come to a terrible fate. The thought made me shiver. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I found a motel and checked in, needing to feel safe. Inside the room, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. I reported the incident to the local authorities the next day. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept thinking about the man in the woods, his wild eyes, and the notebook filled with details about me. It took a long time for me to feel safe again. Every noise, every shadow, made me jump. I avoided the woods, and camping was out of the question. The peace I had sought had turned into a nightmare I couldn't forget. Eventually, I started to rebuild my sense of security. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can change. It started off as a solo trip to clear my head. I drove out to this little town I found online, thinking the peace and quiet would do me good. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts, surrounded by woods and not much else. The town itself was tiny, just a main street with a few shops and a diner. On the first day, I decided to explore. I walked around, taking pictures and enjoying the change of scenery. The locals gave me looks that were hard to read, a mix of curiosity and something else. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured they weren't used to seeing new faces. That evening, I went to the diner for dinner. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of old-timers at the counter and a group of guys at a corner table. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. The waitress, a woman in her 40s, gave me a tight smile as she handed me a menu. I sat down and ordered a burger. As I waited, I couldn't help but feel the eyes on me. The group of guys in the corner were whispering and laughing, and I could tell they were talking about me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone, but the uneasy feeling stayed. After eating, I paid and left quickly. The guys at the corner table watched me the whole time. As I walked out, I heard one of them say something I couldn't quite catch, followed by more laughter. I hurried back to my cabin, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I took a book out onto the porch and tried to relax. Around midday, I noticed a truck driving slowly down the road. It passed by, then came back a few minutes later, stopping a little way down the road. The same group of guys from the diner got out, talking loudly and glancing my way. They stood there for a while, smoking and laughing, making me more and more uneasy. Eventually, they got back in the truck and left, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. I peeked out the window and saw shadows moving near the tree line. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. I felt trapped, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a knock at the door, soft at first, then louder. I didn't move, hoping they'd think no one was home. The knocking stopped, but I could hear them talking in low voices. After what felt like an eternity, they left. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and got ready to leave. I just wanted to get out of there. I threw my bags in the car and started driving, heart pounding. As I reached the edge of town, I saw the truck from the day before, parked by the side of the road. The guys were standing around it, watching me. One of them stepped into the road, forcing me to stop. He walked up to my window, a smirk on his face. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. His tone was mocking, and the others laughed. I didn't answer, just stared straight ahead. He knocked on my window, harder this time. "I'm talking to you." I took a deep breath and slowly rolled down the window, just a crack. "I have to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned closer, eyes dark. "You're not welcome here," he said, voice low and menacing. "Don't come back." He stepped away from the car, and I took my chance, driving away as fast as I could. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the highway. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my grip on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck following me, but it didn't. I've never felt such relief as I did when I finally reached home. I locked all the doors and windows, still jumpy at every little noise. It took days for the fear to fade, but the memory of those men, their eyes filled with malice, stayed with me. I don't think I'll ever go back to that town. I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my mind. The woods always had a calming effect on me, and I thought a weekend away from everything would do me good. I found a quiet spot far from any other campsites, set up my tent, and settled in for the night. The first evening was peaceful, with the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. I stretched and stepped out of my tent, only to find that all my supplies were gone. My food, water, backpack, even my cooking gear, everything was missing. Panic set in as I realized I was miles away from my car and without any means to sustain myself. I noticed tracks leading away from my campsite. They were fresh, the soil still disturbed. Someone had been here during the night, stealing everything while I slept. I knew I had to follow the tracks, hoping to find whoever took my stuff. Maybe I could reason with them, or at least get some of my things back. I grabbed a sturdy branch as a makeshift weapon and started following the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, winding through thick underbrush and around large trees. As I walked, I kept my senses alert, listening for any sounds that might indicate I was getting close. After what felt like hours, I spotted a small clearing up ahead. There was a makeshift camp there, with a couple of tents and a smoldering fire. I approached cautiously, staying hidden behind a tree. I could see two men sitting by the fire, talking in low voices. My heart raced as I realized they must be the ones who took my supplies. I stepped out from behind the tree and called out to them. They both turned to look at me, and I saw a flash of surprise, then anger, in their eyes. I told them I was missing my supplies and asked if they had seen anything. One of the men stood up and approached me, his expression hardening. He denied taking anything and told me to leave. His tone was hostile, and I could tell he wasn't going to be reasonable. The other man got up too, and they both started advancing on me. I backed away, trying to keep my distance. They were bigger than me, and I knew I couldn't take them both in a fight. One of them lunged at me, and I swung the branch, hitting him in the side. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. The other man grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were too strong. They forced me to the ground, pinning me there. I pleaded with them to let me go, telling them I just wanted my supplies back. They laughed, a cruel sound that sent chills down my spine. One of them kicked me in the ribs, and I cried out in pain. They kept me on the ground, taunting me, saying I shouldn't have come here alone. Desperation took over, and I managed to break free for a moment, scrambling to my feet. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps pounding on the forest floor. I pushed myself harder, weaving through the trees, hoping to lose them. I stumbled into a dense thicket and crouched down, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them nearby, cursing and searching for me. My heart was pounding so loud I was afraid they would hear it. I stayed as still as possible, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, their voices grew fainter, and I dared to move. I crept out of the thicket and continued through the forest, staying low and quiet. I needed to get back to my car, but I was completely disoriented. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I felt the pain from the kicks and bruises. I kept moving, every sound making me jump. The forest, which had felt so peaceful before, now seemed full of threats. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, hunting me. I finally stumbled upon a familiar path and followed it, hoping it would lead me back to my campsite. When I reached the site, it was almost dark. My tent was still there, but it felt like a ghost of the safe haven it had been. I quickly gathered what little I had left and started the long trek back to my car. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep going. By the time I reached my car, it was completely dark. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them following me. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my eyes on the road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town. I found a motel and checked in, needing to feel safe. Inside the room, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. I knew I needed to report what happened, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the room. It took me a long time to feel safe again. Every noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The woods, once a place of peace, had become a nightmare I couldn't forget. I kept thinking about the men in the forest, their hostile faces, and the way they had hunted me. I decided to go hiking alone one weekend to clear my head. I found a trail that was far from the usual busy spots. It was late afternoon when I started, and the forest was quiet and peaceful. I liked the solitude, the way the trees blocked out the noise of the world. I walked for a few hours, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birds. As the sun started to set, I noticed a man up ahead. He was limping and looked like he was in pain. He had a backpack, but it was torn, and his clothes were dirty. I approached him, asking if he was okay. He said he had fallen and twisted his ankle. He looked desperate, saying he had been out there for hours and couldn't walk properly. I offered to help him back to the main trail. He seemed grateful, and I felt good about helping someone in need. We walked slowly, his arm over my shoulder for support. He kept thanking me, saying he didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't come along. I told him it was no problem, just glad I could help. As we walked, I noticed he kept looking around, like he was checking for something. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. He was probably just nervous, being injured and all. We talked a bit, but his answers were short, and he seemed distracted. The forest was getting darker, and I suggested we hurry to find a spot to rest for the night. We reached a small clearing, and I set up a little camp. I had a flashlight and some basic supplies, so I gave him some water and a snack. He thanked me again, but there was something off about his tone. It was getting colder, and I suggested we build a small fire. He agreed, and I started gathering some wood. When I got back to the camp, he was rummaging through my backpack. I asked him what he was doing, and he jumped back, saying he was just looking for more water. I handed him a bottle and told him to sit down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't want to leave him there alone. As the fire grew, the flickering light cast strange shadows around us. He kept glancing into the darkness, making me more and more nervous. I asked him where he was from, and his answers were vague. It felt like he was hiding something. I decided to stay awake and keep an eye on him, just in case. Hours passed, and he eventually fell asleep. I sat by the fire, trying to stay alert. I kept thinking about his odd behavior and the way he had looked through my stuff. I wondered if he was really injured or if it was just a ploy. I couldn't let my guard down. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. 2 men stepped into the clearing, both looking rough and dangerous. They saw me and the guy I had helped, and one of them smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. The man I had helped jumped up, his limp suddenly gone. He walked over to them, and they started talking in low voices. My heart was pounding as I realized I had walked into a trap. They turned to me, and one of them pulled out a knife. I backed away, holding up my hands. They told me to sit down and keep quiet. They started going through my things, taking anything valuable. My phone, wallet, even my watch. The guy I had helped just stood there, watching with a smirk on his face. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I had been so stupid to trust him. One of the men started to tie my hands with rope. I struggled, but the other one pressed the knife against my throat, telling me to stay still. They tied me up and pushed me to the ground. I could feel the cold earth against my face, and I knew I was in serious trouble. They started arguing about what to do next. I heard one of them say something about leaving me there, but the other one wanted to take me with them. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. They were distracted, and I realized this might be my only chance. I twisted my hands, feeling the rope loosen just a bit. I kept working at it, trying to stay calm. The men were still arguing, and I saw my chance. I broke free and ran into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran blindly through the forest, branches scratching my face and arms. I tripped and fell, but I got up and kept running. I could hear them getting closer, their voices angry and threatening. I knew I had to find a place to hide. I saw a large tree with thick roots and squeezed myself into a gap between them. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. They ran past, still shouting. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until their voices faded into the distance. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out and started moving again, more carefully this time. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I had to keep moving. I was exhausted and scared, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled upon a main trail. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My body was aching, and I was so tired, but I pushed on. The sky was starting to lighten, and I knew I had to be close to the trailhead. Eventually, I saw a parking lot and nearly cried with relief. I found my car and drove to the nearest town, shaking and covered in dirt. I went straight to the police and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I couldn't shake the fear that those men were still out there. The experience left me shaken and wary. I used to love hiking alone, but now I can't do it without feeling a surge of panic. I found a quiet spot in a national park, far from the usual crowded areas. It was late afternoon when I set up my tent and started a small fire. The forest was peaceful, and I felt at ease. I made some tea and sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of nature. As the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was just a sense, nothing concrete, so I ignored it and tried to relax. When night fell, the feeling grew stronger. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me tense. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't help much. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly and chase away my unease. I zipped up my tent and got into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, thinking about the possibility of someone watching me. A few hours later, I heard footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, not like an animal. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. In the morning, I found a note pinned to a tree near my campsite. It said, "I like watching you." My blood ran cold. Someone had been there, watching me while I slept. I packed up my things quickly, deciding to leave as soon as possible. As I was packing, I noticed more notes. One was under my cooking pot, another inside my tent. They all had similar messages. "You can't hide, I'm always near." Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm and get everything packed. I started hiking back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt threatening. Every sound made me jump. I tried to walk quickly, but not so fast that I would tire myself out. The feeling of being watched was intense, and I knew I had to get out of there. Halfway back to the car, I found another note pinned to a tree along the trail. This one said, "You're making it too easy." My hands were shaking as I read it. I dropped the note and started running. I didn't care about conserving energy anymore. I just needed to get to safety. The trail was rough, and I stumbled several times, but I kept going. I finally reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. I managed to unlock the door and threw my backpack inside. As I was about to get in, I saw another note on the windshield. "I'll see you soon," it read. I jumped into the car and locked the doors, starting the engine with shaking hands. I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police. I told them everything, showed them the notes. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it as seriously as I hoped. They said it was probably a prank, but I knew it was more than that. Someone had been out there, watching me, leaving those notes. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I was alone, I felt eyes on me. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, got security cameras, but it didn't help much. I kept finding notes. On my porch, in my mailbox, even inside my house. "I'm still here," they would say. "You can't hide." I stopped going out alone, always making sure I had someone with me. I changed my routines, trying to be unpredictable. But the notes kept coming. Whoever it was, they were always one step ahead. It was like they could read my mind. One night, I woke up to find a note on my pillow. "Nice try," it said. I screamed and called the police, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. It was like the person was a ghost, slipping in and out without a trace. I knew it was only a matter of time before they did something more than just leave notes. I decided to move, hoping that would help. I found a new place in a different town, didn't tell anyone where I was going. But the notes followed me. "You can't escape," the first one at the new place said. I felt like I was losing my mind. I hired a private investigator, but even he couldn't find anything. Whoever it was, they were good at covering their tracks. He suggested it might be someone I knew, someone with access to my life. That thought terrified me more than anything. It meant I couldn't trust anyone. One night, I heard noises outside my new house. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept to the window. I saw a shadow moving near the back door. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. They arrived quickly, but found no one. Another note was left on the back door, getting closer. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. I decided to confront whoever it was, set a trap to catch them. I told a few trusted friends about my plan, made sure someone knew where I was at all times. I set up cameras and waited. I didn't sleep, barely ate, just waited for them to make their move. It happened a few nights later. I heard someone trying to break in through the back door. I grabbed my bat and my phone, ready to call the police. The cameras caught a man, dressed in black, his face covered. He saw the cameras and ran, but I got a good look at him. I gave the footage to the police, and they finally took me seriously. They caught him a few days later. Turned out he was someone I barely knew, a guy who had fixed my car once. He had become obsessed, following me, leaving the notes. He had a history of stalking, but had never been caught. I was lucky to be alive. I had always loved studying wildlife, especially at night. The forest came alive with sounds and movements that were fascinating to observe. That night, I was out with my camera and notebook, hoping to catch sight of some nocturnal animals. The air was cool, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. I had been out for a couple of hours when I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze, hoping it was a fox or maybe even an owl. But what stepped out of the shadows made my blood run cold. It was a group of men, dressed in dark clothing and carrying guns. Poachers. I ducked behind a tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't see me. They moved through the forest with a sense of purpose, clearly looking for something. I knew I couldn't let them see me. If they found out I was there, things could get dangerous. They stopped a few yards away from my hiding spot, talking in low voices. I strained to hear their conversation. "We need to find that deer," one of them said. "The boss won't be happy if we come back empty-handed." Another man replied, "Yeah, but we also need to be careful. There are reports of people studying the wildlife here. We can't afford to get caught." I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't risk moving and drawing their attention. I waited, hoping they would move on. But instead, they split up, spreading out through the forest. One of them started walking in my direction. I pressed myself against a tree, barely daring to breathe. He got closer, and I could see the glint of his gun in the moonlight. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I had no way to defend myself, and if they found me, I knew they wouldn't hesitate to use their weapons. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as he came closer and closer. Just as he was about to pass by my hiding spot, he stopped. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look my way. He turned his head, and for a terrifying moment, our eyes met. I saw the surprise and then the anger in his eyes. "Hey!" he shouted, raising his gun. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear him shouting behind me, calling for the others. Branches whipped at my face, and my legs burned as I pushed myself to run faster. I could hear them crashing through the forest, getting closer. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I stumbled over roots and nearly fell several times, but I kept running. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I knew I couldn't keep this up for much longer. I saw a fallen log up ahead and dove behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened, trying to hear if they were still following me. The forest was silent except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I dared to peek over the log, but I couldn't see anyone. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving, find a way to get help. I took a deep breath and started moving again, more cautiously this time. I tried to stay low, using the trees and underbrush for cover. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them at any moment. I stumbled upon a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The water was cold, and I slipped on the rocks several times, but I kept going. The sound of the stream helped to mask my movements, and I hoped it would throw the poachers off my trail. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small cabin, and I felt a glimmer of hope. I made my way toward it, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I got closer, I saw that it was empty, probably an old hunting cabin. I slipped inside and bolted the door behind me. I collapsed on the floor, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. I knew I couldn't stay there for long, but I needed a moment to gather my thoughts. I looked around the cabin, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself. There was an old rifle mounted on the wall, but it was rusty and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I grabbed it anyway, hoping it might at least scare the poachers if they found me. I also found a small hunting knife in a drawer, which I tucked into my belt. I knew I couldn't just wait there and hope for the best. I had to find a way to get help. I peeked out the window, scanning the forest for any sign of the poachers. I didn't see anything, but I knew they were still out there. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping back out into the night. I moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and trying to be as quiet as possible. I had to find a way back to my car, which was parked a couple of miles away at the edge of the forest. I followed the stream again, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. Every sound made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the poachers at any moment. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I felt a sense of dread growing in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the trail up ahead. I quickened my pace, desperate to get to my car and out of there. But as I got closer, I heard voices. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The poachers were there, searching for me. I ducked behind a tree, trying to stay out of sight. I could see them moving through the forest, their flashlights sweeping the ground. I knew I had to be careful, or they would find me. I waited until they moved on, then continued toward the trail, staying as low and quiet as possible. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking, and finally got the door open. I jumped inside and locked the doors, starting the engine and backing out as quickly as I could. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the poachers chasing after me. But there was nothing. I drove for miles, not stopping until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of a nearby town. I called the police, my hands still shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. They took my report and promised to send someone to check it out, but I didn't feel safe until I was back home. The experience haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every little sound made me jump. I learned a hard lesson that night. The forest, which I had always found so peaceful, now held a sense of danger. I still love studying wildlife, but I'm much more cautious now. I never go out alone, and I always make sure someone knows where I am. Last summer, I planned a weekend camping trip with my girlfriend, Mia. We wanted to escape the city, get some fresh air, and enjoy nature. We found a remote spot in the woods, far from any usual campsite, thinking it would give us some peace and quiet. We arrived late afternoon and started setting up our tent. The place was perfect quiet, surrounded by trees, and with a small clearing for our campfire. Everything seemed fine until we took a short walk around to gather firewood. That's when we stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite about 200 meters from ours. The campsite was a mess. The tent was torn, and camping gear was scattered everywhere. There were clothes, a couple of shoes, and a backpack lying open with its contents spilled out. The sight gave me a bad feeling. Mia suggested we should leave it alone and head back, but curiosity got the better of me. As I walked around, I noticed signs of a struggle: broken branches, disturbed ground, and deep marks in the dirt as if someone had been dragged. My heart began to race. Mia's face turned pale when she saw it too. We exchanged a worried glance and agreed to head back to our site. Back at our campsite, we tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it was hard. We decided to make dinner and keep the fire going all night. Darkness fell, and the woods became eerily silent. Every crackle of the fire seemed louder than usual, and every rustle in the trees made us jump. Around midnight, Mia noticed something. She pointed to a spot in the distance where a faint light flickered through the trees. It wasn't our campfire. Someone was out there. We decided to stay quiet and put out our fire, hoping to stay unnoticed. As we sat in the dark, we heard voices. They were low, almost whispering, but they were definitely there. My stomach churned with fear. I grabbed a flashlight and a small knife from our gear. Mia clung to me, shaking. The voices grew louder, and we could hear footsteps approaching. We knew we had to leave. I whispered to Mia to pack our essentials quietly. As we were packing, the footsteps stopped right outside our tent. We froze, barely breathing. The tent zipper started to move slowly. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. Suddenly, the zipper stopped, and we heard a man's voice. "Are you in there?" It was calm, almost too calm. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The man spoke again. "We know you're in there. Come out, and no one gets hurt." Mia started to cry silently. I knew we couldn't stay. I motioned for her to follow me, and we crawled out the back of the tent as quietly as we could. We moved slowly, trying to stay in the shadows. We could hear more footsteps, multiple people now. As we got to the edge of the clearing, a flashlight beam swept over where we had just been. We ran. Branches slapped our faces, and the ground was uneven, but we kept going, not daring to look back. We could hear them behind us, shouting and crashing through the underbrush. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I got the door open, and we jumped in. I started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the figures emerging from the woods. They were close, too close. I floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, gravel flying. As we sped down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting them to be right behind us. But the road remained empty. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, where we finally felt somewhat safe. We drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police. We told them everything, and they took our statements seriously. They said they'd send officers to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those people wouldn't be there when they arrived. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures in the woods. Mia and I decided never to go camping again. The memory of that night is still fresh, and I often wonder what would have happened if we hadn't gotten out when we did. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers and footsteps. It was a cool, quiet night, perfect for camping. My friends and I had set up our tents by the lake, miles away from the nearest town. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright, reflecting off the still water. We had spent the evening around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to embers, and we were getting ready to turn in for the night. That's when we saw the lights. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, but it quickly grew brighter. It wasn't the kind of light from a campsite or a flashlight. It was strange, flickering and moving. We all noticed it at the same time. "What do you think that is?" Matt asked, pointing towards the lights. None of us had an answer. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, following the light. It seemed to be coming from the woods on the other side of the lake. As we got closer, the flickering grew more intense, and we could hear faint sounds, like murmured voices and the occasional crackle, almost like a fire but not quite. The hike took about 20 minutes. The woods were dark and eerie, and every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. I could tell the others were nervous too, but no one said anything. Finally, we reached the edge of a clearing, and we could see the source of the light more clearly. What we saw made my blood run cold. There were about a dozen people gathered around a fire, but it wasn't an ordinary campfire. They were burning something in a large metal drum, and the flames were shooting high into the air. The people were wearing dark clothes and masks, and they seemed to be engaged in some kind of ritual. They were chanting in low voices, their words indistinct but menacing. "Guys, we should get out of here," whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. We all nodded, but before we could move, one of the men looked up and saw us. "Hey! Who's there?" he shouted, his voice sharp and angry. The chanting stopped, and all heads turned in our direction. Panic set in. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise we were making. Behind us, I could hear the men shouting and starting to give chase. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped in my face, and I stumbled over roots, but I didn't stop. We finally made it back to our campsite, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Matt panted, looking over his shoulder. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We quickly packed up our gear, our hands trembling with fear. Just as we were finishing, we heard them coming. The men were closing in, their flashlights bobbing through the trees. "Go! Go! Go!" I shouted. We grabbed what we could and sprinted to the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped off, leaving the campsite and those terrifying men behind. We drove in silence for a long time, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the main road that we started to talk about what had happened. "Do you think they were poachers or something?" Sarah asked, her voice still shaky. "I don't know," I replied, "but whatever they were doing, it wasn't legal. We need to report this." We stopped at the nearest town and went straight to the police station. The officer on duty listened to our story, taking notes. "We'll send a team out to investigate," he assured us. "You did the right thing by coming here." We gave our statements, describing the location and what we had seen. Afterward, we drove home, still shaken. None of us spoke much during the ride. The memory of those masked men and their strange ritual haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying the events over and over. The next day, the police called to let us know they had found the site but no sign of the men. They assured us they would keep an eye on the area, but it didn't make me feel any better. The whole experience left a deep scar on all of us. We had gone looking for adventure and found something far more sinister. Since that night, I've been wary of the woods, especially at night. I still love camping, but I'm much more cautious now. I planned a solo trip to a small, remote village to conduct research for my anthropology thesis. It was a peaceful place, tucked away in the hills, perfect for studying the traditional lifestyle of its residents. I arrived in the afternoon, settled into a modest inn, and immediately started exploring the area. The first day went smoothly. I met some villagers, took notes, and even managed to record a few interviews. That evening, as I was going through my notes at the local cafe, an older couple approached me. They introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Harding, longtime residents of the village. They seemed friendly and genuinely interested in my work. We chatted for a while, and they invited me to their home for dinner. I thought it would be a great opportunity to learn more about the village, so I accepted. Their house was a quaint, old-fashioned cottage, filled with antique furniture and family photos. Mrs. Harding cooked a hearty meal, and we spent hours talking about the village's history and customs. When I finally returned to the inn, it was late. I felt a bit uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I brushed it off as nerves from being in an unfamiliar place. The next day, the Hardings found me again. They seemed even more eager to talk, asking detailed questions about my research and personal life. Their interest felt flattering at first, but it quickly became overwhelming. Everywhere I went, they seemed to appear. If I was interviewing someone, they'd be nearby, watching. If I was walking through the village, they'd coincidentally bump into me. One afternoon, they insisted on showing me an old, abandoned church at the edge of the village. It was a long walk, and the place was eerie and secluded. I felt a growing sense of dread, but they were insistent. Inside the church, Mr. Harding started talking about how the village needed someone to preserve its legacy. His eyes had a strange gleam, and Mrs. Harding stood too close, blocking the exit. I mumbled an excuse about needing to check my notes and hurry out. They followed, but I managed to slip away, heart pounding. Back at the inn, I locked my door and tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my window. I froze, too scared to move. The scratching continued for a few minutes, then stopped. In the morning, I found deep marks on the window frame, like someone had tried to pry it open. I decided to leave the village early. I packed my things and went to the bus stop, but the Hardings were there, waiting. They smiled, but their eyes were cold. Mrs. Harding said they had something important to show me before I left. I refused, but they grabbed my arms and dragged me to their car. I screamed for help, but no one came. They drove me to their house and locked me in a room. The walls were covered in photos of young women, all looking terrified. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't the first. I banged on the door, but it was solid and heavy. Hours passed, and they finally opened the door, carrying a tray of food. I tried to rush past them, but Mr. Harding was strong and threw me back inside. They watched me eat, smiling like nothing was wrong. I knew I had to escape, but there was no way out. They left, locking the door behind them. I searched the room, finding a small window high up on the wall. It was a tight squeeze, but I managed to push through, cutting myself on the broken glass. I ran through the woods, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I stumbled onto the main road, flagged down a car, and begged the driver to take me to the nearest town. I told the police everything, but when they searched the Harding's house, it was empty. No photos, no signs of struggle, nothing. I returned to the city, but I couldn't focus on my thesis. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the Hardings. Nights were the worst. Every noise made me jump. I still have nightmares about that room and their cold smiles. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. It was late summer, and the weather was perfect. I found a spot by a small, quiet lake, far from any roads or towns. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and enjoyed the peacefulness. On the second day, as I was making breakfast, I saw a man walking along the trail near my campsite. He looked rough, like he hadn't showered in weeks, with dirty clothes and unkempt hair. He waved at me and approached, asking if he could rest for a bit. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. He introduced himself as Rick and said he was just passing through, looking for work. He seemed harmless at first, so I offered him some coffee. We chatted for a while, and he asked a lot of questions about my trip and how long I planned to stay. His curiosity felt odd, but I figured he was just lonely. As the day went on, Rick hung around, even after I tried to hint that I wanted some alone time. He started helping himself to my food and made himself comfortable. When I suggested he move on, he laughed it off and said he'd leave soon. My unease grew, but I tried to stay calm. That evening, I noticed Rick rummaging through my gear. When I confronted him, he got defensive and angry, claiming he was just looking for a blanket because he was cold. I didn't believe him, but I didn't want to provoke him further, so I let it go. The next morning, I woke up to find Rick had taken over my campfire, cooking breakfast with my supplies. I told him he needed to leave, but he ignored me. When I tried to pack up my things, he blocked my way and said I should stay another night and enjoy the nature. His tone was menacing, and I realized he wasn't going to leave willingly. I spent the day trying to avoid Rick, but he followed me everywhere. When I went to the lake to fish, he sat nearby, watching me. When I tried to hike a bit, he trailed behind, always keeping me in sight. I felt trapped and scared, unsure of how to get rid of him. That evening, Rick's behavior took a darker turn. He became more aggressive, demanding that I share everything with him because he was part of the camp now. I didn't know what to do. I tried to stay calm and avoid a confrontation, but my fear was mounting. As night fell, I decided I had to leave. I quietly packed a small bag with essentials, planning to hike to my car and get help. But as I was about to slip away, Rick appeared out of the darkness, grabbing my arm and pulling me back to the campfire. He accused me of trying to abandon him and became violent, shoving me to the ground. In the struggle, I managed to break free and ran into the woods. I could hear Rick shouting and crashing through the underbrush behind me. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the dark, trying to find the trail. I tripped over roots and branches, scraping my hands and knees, but I didn't stop. Finally, I reached a dirt road. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights approaching. I flagged down the car, and the driver, an older man, let me in. I frantically told him what had happened, and he drove me to the nearest town. I reported the incident to the local authorities. They took my statement and promised to look into it. I never found out if they caught Rick, but I was just glad to be safe. I had taken a few days off from work to escape the noise of the city. I chose a campsite deep in the forest, far from any main roads or towns. It was a place I had been to once before, years ago, and remembered it being quiet and serene. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the night, enjoying the silence and the fresh air. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a bit, took some photos, and just relaxed. As night fell, I made dinner over the fire and then crawled into my tent. The night was cool, and I slept soundly until the early morning when I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint rustling, like someone was moving around outside my tent. I dismissed it as an animal and went back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I found a note pinned to the outside of my tent. It was written in shaky, uneven handwriting, "Leave now, or else." My heart pounded as I read it. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a prank, maybe some kids trying to scare campers. Still, the note bothered me. I decided to stay, thinking that whoever left the note was probably long gone. I spent the day fishing and exploring the area. When I returned to my campsite in the evening, everything seemed normal. I made dinner and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the solitude. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jumpy. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, soft footsteps, and whispers. I told myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I found another note. This one was more aggressive. "This is your last warning. Leave or you'll regret it." My hands trembled as I read it. The notes were getting more threatening, and I was starting to feel real fear. I packed up some of my gear, intending to move to a different spot, but as I was loading my car, I saw them. 3 men, standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces partially hidden by hoods. I froze, my heart racing. They didn't say anything, just stood there, staring. I decided to confront them. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. They didn't respond. After a few tense moments, they turned and walked back into the woods. I quickly finished packing and decided to leave. I didn't want to stick around to find out what they had planned. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to follow me. After about half an hour, I started to relax. I figured I had scared them off, or they had given up. But then I saw it. Another note, this one taped to a tree right where I had parked my car earlier. I hadn't noticed it before. It simply said, "We warned you." I drove faster, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The road was rough, and my car bounced and rattled. I didn't care, I just wanted to get out of there. I drove until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police station and told them everything. The officer on duty listened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He took my statement and promised to send someone to check the area. I spent the night in a motel, unable to sleep. Every noise made me jump. I kept thinking about those men, wondering who they were and what they wanted. The next day, I called the police. They told me they had found my campsite, but there was no sign of the men or any notes. They said it was probably a prank, but I knew it was more than that. I decided to cut my trip short and go home. The experience had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I felt like I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. It took weeks for me to feel normal again, and even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those footsteps, seeing those men in my mind. That weekend was supposed to be a break from reality, a chance to relax and recharge. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. I went camping alone last month to unwind from work. I picked a remote spot in the woods, far from the usual hiking trails. The weather was nice, and I thought it would be a perfect way to get away from everything. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking and sitting by the fire. But on the third day, something strange happened. As I was out for a morning walk, I noticed a faint smell of gasoline. It was odd, given how secluded the area was. I followed the smell, curious. It led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser. After a while, I came across a small clearing. There, hidden among the trees, was a rundown cabin I hadn't seen before. It looked abandoned at first, but then I saw some fresh footprints around it. I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I heard voices coming from inside. I crept up and peered through a crack in the door. What I saw made my heart race. Inside the cabin were several people. They were surrounded by stacks of bags and boxes, and there were large containers filled with what looked like chemicals. They were talking in low voices, and I caught snippets of conversation about deliveries and deals. It hit me that this was some kind of drug operation. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. I was about to turn and leave when one of the men suddenly stepped outside. I froze behind a tree, holding my breath. He walked right past me, and I had to wait until he was out of sight before I moved. I started making my way back to my campsite as quietly as I could. My mind raced. I knew I had to get out of there and call the authorities, but I was worried they'd come looking for me. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. As I packed my gear, I kept glancing around, half expecting someone to show up. The cabin was still in sight, but I couldn't see anyone around it. I hurriedly stuffed my things into my backpack and decided to take a different route to avoid being seen. I started hiking away from the cabin, trying to stay calm. But then I heard voices again, closer this time. I ducked behind some bushes and watched as 3 men emerged from the woods, heading in the direction I'd just come from. They were shouting at each other, and I could hear them talking about searching the area. Panic set in. I had to find a safer path. I chose to head uphill, hoping the higher ground would give me a better vantage point and help me avoid being seen. I moved quickly but carefully, trying not to make any noise. After what felt like hours, I reached a small ridge. From there, I could see the cabin in the distance, and I noticed that the men were still searching the area. I waited until they were out of sight before making my way down to the nearest road. When I finally reached the road, I was exhausted and scared. I flagged down a passing car and explained the situation to the driver. He seemed skeptical but agreed to take me to the nearest town. In town, I reported everything to the police. They took my statement and said they'd look into it. I gave them the details of where I'd seen the cabin and described the people I'd seen, They assured me they'd investigate. I went camping last month at a remote site I'd never been to before. I had heard it was quiet and isolated, which is exactly why I chose it. I was hoping for some peace and quiet away from the city. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, and the campsite was peaceful. On the second day, I went for a hike and spent most of the afternoon exploring the nearby trails. I returned to my tent around dusk, feeling tired but content. As I approached, I noticed something was off. The first sign was a faint rustling sound coming from my tent. My heart started to race. When I got closer, I saw that the tent's entrance was partially open. My gut told me something was wrong. I cautiously approached and saw that the tent had been slashed open. The fabric was ripped in several places. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly unzipped the remaining part of the entrance and looked inside. My belongings were scattered everywhere. My clothes, food, and camping gear were all tossed around. My backpack, which had my wallet and phone, was lying in the corner, ripped open. I was in shock, trying to process what had happened. I felt a mix of anger and fear. Anger at whoever did this and fear of what they might do next. I looked around the campsite, but there was no one in sight. I couldn't tell if they were still nearby or if they had left already. I decided to look for any clues. I saw some footprints leading away from the tent, but they quickly disappeared into the dirt. There was no clear path, and the area was overgrown. It was getting dark, and I knew I had to make a decision quickly. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and my first instinct was to pack up and leave. I started gathering my things, trying to salvage what I could. I had to be quick, and the thought of someone potentially coming back made me move faster. As I was packing up, I heard a twig snap nearby. I froze, my heart pounding. I scanned the surrounding woods, but there was no one to be seen. I tried to ignore the sound and focused on getting my gear together. I had nearly finished packing when I heard a low voice from behind me. It was hard to make out the words, but it sounded like someone was talking, not too far away. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. With a final glance around the campsite, I realized I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my keys and gear, shoved everything into my car, and drove away, leaving the campsite behind. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I drove to the nearest town and found a small motel. I rented a room for the night and called the police to report the incident. I gave them all the details I could remember and told them about the slashed tent and the scattered belongings. They took my report seriously and said they would send someone to check out the campsite. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept the lights on and stayed awake, waiting for morning. I didn't feel safe until I was back in the city. I decided to take a weekend off and go hiking alone in the state park. I needed some time away from the city and work. The park was huge, with miles of trails, and I knew it would be the perfect place to clear my head. I packed my backpack, loaded my car, and drove out early on Saturday morning. The weather was perfect, cool and sunny. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started my hike. The first few hours were great. I enjoyed the sounds of nature, the smell of the trees, and the feeling of being alone in the wilderness. I didn't see many other hikers, which was exactly what I wanted. Around midday, I stopped to eat some lunch. I found a nice spot by a stream and sat down to rest. While I was eating, I noticed a man coming down the trail. He looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. He had a wild look in his eyes. As he got closer, I felt a pang of unease. "Hey, there," he called out, his voice rough. "You got any water? I've been lost out here for days." I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, I have some. Are you okay?" He walked over and I handed him a water bottle. He drank greedily, almost finishing the whole thing. "Thanks," he said, wiping his mouth. "I got separated from my group a few days ago. Been wandering around trying to find my way back." I felt sorry for him, but something about his story didn't add up. He had no gear, no backpack, nothing that a hiker would have. "Where did you get lost?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Up near the ridge," he said, pointing vaguely. "I've been trying to head back to the main road." I offered him some food, which he took eagerly. As he ate, I noticed he kept glancing around, almost like he was checking if anyone else was nearby. The feeling of unease grew stronger. "I can show you the way back," I said. "I have a map, and I know these trails pretty well." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "That's kind of you, but I'll find my own way. Just needed a bit of rest and some water." Something in his voice made me uneasy. "It's no trouble, really," I insisted. "I'm heading back that way anyway." He stood up, brushing crumbs off his hands. "Thanks for the offer, but I'll be fine." He turned and started walking back the way he came, disappearing into the trees. I watched him go, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something off about him. I decided to pack up and head back, feeling uneasy about staying out there alone. I put out my fire, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. About an hour later, I heard rustling in the bushes ahead. I stopped, my heart pounding, and saw the same man step out onto the trail. He looked surprised to see me. "Oh, it's you again," he said, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Heading back to my car." He nodded, but his eyes were cold. "Be careful out here. You never know who you might run into." I nodded and walked past him, my skin crawling. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had the feeling he was following me, but every time I looked back, I saw nothing. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to get back to my car before dark. I quickened my pace, my heart racing. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. I pushed myself to keep moving, not daring to stop. Finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. Relief washed over me. I jogged the last few yards to my car, fumbling for my keys. As I unlocked the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the man emerging from the trees, his face twisted in anger. "You shouldn't have come back here," he growled, his voice low and menacing. I jumped into my car and locked the doors. He banged on the window, shouting. I started the engine and floored it, gravel spraying as I sped out of the parking lot. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me with a look of pure rage. I drove straight to the ranger station and told them everything. They took me seriously, sending out a search team. Later, I found out that the man was a fugitive, hiding out in the park to avoid capture. He had been on the run for weeks, and I had stumbled right into his hiding place. The rangers found his campsite and some of his belongings, but he was gone. I was lucky to get out when I did. I went camping with my friend Jessica a few weeks ago. We picked a spot by a small lake, surrounded by dense woods. The place seemed perfect for a quiet weekend away from the city. We set up our tent, built a fire, and settled in for a relaxing evening. Everything was going great until we heard some voices from a distance. At first, we thought it was just other campers. But the voices got closer and closer, and they sounded like they were getting rowdier. Jessica and I tried to ignore it, thinking they'd pass by. But they didn't. Instead, the voices stopped just beyond the edge of our campsite. We saw a group of men standing at the edge of the clearing. They were laughing loudly, drinking, and shouting. It was clear they were pretty drunk. Jessica and I exchanged uneasy glances. We hoped they'd move on soon, but they didn't. After a while, one of them, who looked like the leader, sauntered over to our camp. "Hey there, ladies. Mind if we hang out for a bit?" he asked with a grin. His tone was too casual, too confident. Jessica and I were already uncomfortable, but we tried to be polite. "We'd really prefer some privacy," I said, hoping they'd take the hint. But they didn't. The man just laughed and said, "Come on, we're just here to have some fun. It's not every day we see people camping out here." We tried to ignore them and went back to our campfire. But the men didn't leave. They kept talking loudly, making crude jokes, and occasionally glancing over at us. Their behavior was making both of us increasingly anxious. Then one of the men, who was wearing a leather jacket and seemed even more drunk than the others, staggered over to our camp. "You sure you don't want to join us?" he slurred. He was getting too close for comfort. Jessica and I exchanged worried looks. I said, "We really don't want to socialize. Please leave us alone." The man's face changed. His grin faded, replaced by a scowl. "You think you're too good for us," he snapped. His tone was suddenly threatening. We tried to stay calm. "We're just here to enjoy a quiet night. Please go away," I said firmly. The man didn't take kindly to that. He called out to his friends, who came over and surrounded our campsite. They were all looking at us with a mix of curiosity and hostility. One of the men, who was taller and had a scruffy beard, said, "You two are making a big mistake. We don't take kindly to being ignored." Jessica was visibly shaken. I could see her hands trembling. I felt a knot of fear tightening in my chest. I tried to stay composed and said, "Look, we're just trying to have a peaceful night. We don't want any trouble." But the men didn't listen. They started making physical threats, stepping closer, and blocking our way. It was clear they weren't going to leave voluntarily. Jessica tried to reason with them, but it only seemed to make them more aggressive. One of them grabbed a stick from the fire pit and waved it around, making it clear they were willing to use force. I knew we had to do something, and fast. I told Jessica to pack up whatever she could quickly. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering the situation as calmly as I could manage. While Jessica packed up our gear, I kept an eye on the men. They were getting more agitated, shouting and jeering. I tried to buy us some time by pretending to be more confident than I felt, hoping they'd back off. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. The men seemed to hear them too. Their demeanor changed instantly from aggressive to nervous. They started mumbling and shuffling around. The police arrived, and the men quickly scattered into the woods. The officers checked in with us and took our statements. They said they'd patrol the area to make sure the men didn't come back. Once the police left, Jessica and I finished packing up our things. We were both shaken but relieved to be leaving. We drove to a nearby town and stayed in a motel for the rest of the night. The encounter left us both feeling scared and violated. We were grateful that the situation didn't escalate further and that we were able to get help in time. I decided to go for a hike in the woods near my hometown. I always loved the peace and quiet of nature, and I needed a break from the daily grind. It was a nice day, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set off down the trail. The first part of the hike was relaxing. I listened to the birds, admired the trees, and let my mind wander. After about an hour, I decided to take a less traveled path that I'd noticed before but never explored. It was narrow and overgrown, but I felt adventurous. As I walked, the trail got more difficult to follow. The brush was thick, and I had to push through branches and tall grass. After a while, I started to regret my decision. It was getting harder to see the trail, and I wasn't sure where it led. But I pressed on, thinking it would eventually loop back to the main path. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I didn't have time to react. I fell into a pit, landing hard on the dirt floor. Pain shot through my leg, and I cried out. I looked up and saw the sky far above me. The walls of the pit were steep and lined with roots and rocks. I tried to stand, but my leg was throbbing. I realized it might be broken. I looked around the pit and saw something that made my blood run cold. There were wooden spikes sticking out of the walls, hidden by leaves and dirt. This was no accident. Someone had dug this trap on purpose. Panic set in. I tried to climb out, but the pain in my leg was too much. I screamed for help, hoping someone might hear me, but the forest was silent. I was miles from the main trail, and it was unlikely anyone would come this way. Hours passed, and the sun started to set. I was hungry, thirsty, and terrified. I knew I had to get out before nightfall. I tore a piece of fabric from my shirt and tied it around my leg, hoping it would help. Then I tried again to climb, using the roots for support. I managed to get a few feet off the ground, but the pain was unbearable. I slipped and fell back into the pit. Despair washed over me. I didn't know what to do. As the light faded, I heard something that made my heart pound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the pit. I looked up and saw a figure standing there, silhouetted against the darkening sky. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their eyes on me. Help! I called out, my voice trembling. Please, help me. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching. Then they spoke, their voice cold and emotionless. You shouldn't have come here. Please, I begged. I'm hurt. I need help. The figure crouched down, and I saw their face. It was a man, his expression hard and unfeeling. This is my land, he said. I don't like trespassers. I felt a surge of fear. This man had set the trap, and he had no intention of helping me. I didn't know, I said. I'm sorry. Just let me go, please. He shook his head. I can't do that. You've seen too much. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I won't tell anyone, I promised. I just want to go home. He stood up and walked away, leaving me in the pit. I screamed after him, but he didn't turn back. Darkness fell, and I was alone, trapped and helpless. I tried to stay calm, but the fear and pain were overwhelming. I don't know how long I was there, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares. When I woke, the sun was rising. My throat was dry, and my leg was swollen and throbbing. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out, somehow. I forced myself to stand, gritting my teeth against the pain. I grabbed a root and started to climb, inch by inch. My hands were raw and bleeding, but I didn't stop. It felt like an eternity, but finally, I reached the top. I pulled myself over the edge and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. I knew I couldn't rest. I had to get away from there, fast. I crawled through the brush, trying to stay hidden. Every sound made me jump, but I didn't see the man. I didn't know if he was watching, but I couldn't take any chances. I made my way back to the main trail, each step agony. When I finally saw the trailhead in my car, I almost cried with relief. I got in and drove to the nearest town, my mind racing. I went to the hospital, where they treated my leg and hands. I told the police what happened, but they didn't find the man. I don't know if they even looked. They said it was probably just an accident, but I knew better. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, just me in the woods. The campsite was a few miles from the nearest road, and I thought it was perfect for some solitude. I arrived in the late afternoon, set up my tent, and made sure everything was in place. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and went to bed early, looking forward to a few days of relaxation. But when I woke up the next morning, things felt off. My sleeping bag was unzipped, and my backpack was not where I had left it. I figured maybe I'd been careless or that I was just tired and misplaced things. I went outside to check my gear. My tent had been moved a little, and the straps on my backpack were loose. It didn't look like a lot had been disturbed, but it felt strange. I was alone in the woods, so I brushed it off as possibly the wind or maybe an animal. I started to unpack and get things ready for the day. Later that day, I noticed some of my food supplies were missing. I thought maybe I had miscounted or overlooked something. It was just a couple of items, so it wasn't a huge deal, but it was definitely weird. I decided to check my tent and make sure everything was still in order. When I went inside, I saw that my gear was scattered. My camping stove was out of its bag, and some of my clothes were tossed around. At this point, I was starting to get anxious. I was sure I had packed everything properly the night before. I started to clean up and organize things, but the more I looked, the more I realized things were missing or out of place. My water bottle, which I'd left on the ground by my tent, was gone. I was beginning to feel uneasy, like someone had been there and wanted me to notice. As evening approached, I decided to make a quick trip to the nearby lake for some fishing. The thought of being around water helped calm my nerves a little. I fished for a couple of hours, catching nothing but small fish. The sun began to set, and I started heading back to camp. When I returned, I saw that my tent was now completely unzipped. The wind wasn't strong enough to have done that. My heart started pounding. I quickly checked inside, and this time, my sleeping bag was missing. Everything else seemed untouched, but I knew something was seriously wrong. I felt a rush of panic. Whoever had been there had deliberately tampered with my gear. I was alone, far from any help, and now I had no sleeping bag. I knew I needed to figure out what to do fast. I packed up as much of my gear as I could and kept a close watch on the surroundings. It was getting dark, and I could see the outline of the forest around me. I heard rustling noises, but whenever I turned my flashlight towards them, nothing was there. I knew I had to stay alert. I decided to make a quick call to a friend to let them know what was happening. I managed to get a signal and told them I was having some trouble and needed help. I didn't want to alarm them too much, but I was starting to feel genuinely scared. As night fell, I stayed awake, keeping an eye on the perimeter of my campsite. Every crackle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I felt like I was being watched, and the feeling didn't go away. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do next. Around midnight, I heard footsteps coming closer to my campsite. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the ring of light from my campfire. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but there was no one there. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, trying to stay awake. As dawn approached, I saw a figure moving in the distance. I couldn't make out details, but it looked like someone was walking away from my campsite. I didn't know if they had been watching me all night or if they were just passing through. When the sun finally came up, I packed up everything I could and prepared to leave. I felt a mixture of relief and fear. I made sure to double-check my surroundings and notice more signs of disturbance around the campsite. It was clear now that someone had deliberately tried to make me feel vulnerable and isolated. I finally made it back to my car and drove to the nearest ranger station. I reported everything that had happened. They took my report seriously and promised to send someone out to check the area. I never did find out who had tampered with my gear or why, but I was grateful to be out of the woods and safe. That experience left me shaken. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone to clear my head. I found a remote campsite, far away from the busy campgrounds. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, surrounded by thick forest. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for a peaceful night. As the sun set, I enjoyed the tranquility, listening to the sounds of the forest. Around midnight, I heard rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the sounds grew louder. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. A man stood at the edge of my campsite, looking disheveled and confused. "I'm lost," he said, his voice shaky. "Can you help me?" I was startled but tried to stay calm. "Sure, I have a map." "Where are you trying to go?" He stepped closer, his eyes darting around nervously. I got turned around. "I just need to get back to the main road." I handed him my map, but he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he kept his eyes on me, studying me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was off. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Tom," he replied quickly. "Listen, can I just stay here for the night?" "I'll leave in the morning." Every instinct told me to say no, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. "I guess that's okay. You can sleep by the fire." He nodded and sat down, warming his hands. I returned to my tent but left the flap open, watching him closely. He seemed jittery, constantly looking around. After a while, he lay down and appeared to sleep. I tried to relax but kept one eye open. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of my tent zipper. I froze, heart pounding. Tom was standing over me, holding my flashlight. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Can I get some water?" I handed him my water bottle, my hand shaking. He took it and stepped outside. I knew I couldn't stay here with him. I needed to leave, now. I quietly gathered my things, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, I heard him rummaging through my supplies outside. I peeked out and saw him holding my knife. "Tom, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, a sinister smile on his face. "You know, it's not safe out here alone. You never know who you might run into." My blood ran cold. "I think you should leave," I said, trying to sound firm. He took a step towards me, and I backed into my tent. "I don't think I will," he said. I grabbed my phone, trying to call for help, but he lunged at me, knocking it out of my hand. I scrambled to get away, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Don't fight," he hissed. I kicked him as hard as I could, and he let go, cursing. I darted out of the tent, running into the woods. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I ran blindly, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. I stumbled and fell, my ankle twisting painfully. I forced myself up, limping forward. I heard him shouting, getting closer. I saw a large tree and ducked behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears. He walked past me, cursing under his breath. I stayed perfectly still until his footsteps faded. Then, I slowly made my way back to my campsite, grabbing my keys and a few essentials. I hobbled to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached it, I jumped in and locked the doors. I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I drove to the nearest town and went straight to the police. My brother Mike and I decided to spend a couple of days hiking in the woods. We chose a secluded trail that promised some peace and quiet. We were both looking forward to escaping the noise and stress of the city. The weather was perfect as we set out, with clear skies and a light breeze. Everything felt right as we made our way deeper into the forest. By late afternoon, we had set up our camp at a small clearing beside a creek. The area was serene, and we felt completely alone. We pitched the tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared for a cozy evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a fire and cooked some dinner. Everything was going smoothly, and we were enjoying the calm of the forest. Just as the sky was darkening, we noticed a man approaching from the trail. At first, he seemed like a regular hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. He was dressed in worn-out clothes and had a heavy backpack. We greeted him and offered him some food, thinking he might be in need. He accepted the offer but seemed oddly quiet and reserved. After he finished eating, he mentioned that he had lost his way and needed to head back to the main trail. We offered him directions, but he insisted on staying for a while longer. Something about his insistence made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. We had some small talk around the fire, and he eventually left, heading back into the woods. Mike and I were relieved when he finally left. It wasn't just the man's presence that had unsettled us, it was the way he had looked at us. It felt like he was sizing us up, but I didn't want to worry Mike too much. We finished up our evening and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. I sat up and listened. The sounds of twigs snapping and footsteps near our camp made my heart race. I nudged Mike, and we both got up to investigate. We checked around the campsite but didn't see anything. The noise stopped, and we tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal. The next morning, we decided to pack up and move to another spot, thinking maybe we'd be better off further along the trail. As we were packing, I noticed some broken branches and disturbed ground near our campsite. It looked like someone had been wandering around our site recently, but there was no sign of the man from the night before. We started hiking again, trying to put the uneasy feeling behind us. About an hour into our hike, we noticed a figure following us. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, but as we continued, it became clear that the person was keeping pace with us. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. When we stopped for a break, the figure stopped too. I glanced back and saw it was the same man from the night before. He was now closer and watching us intently. My heart sank. He seemed to be moving deliberately, almost as if he was waiting for something. Mike noticed too, and we both felt a growing sense of dread. We tried to pick up the pace, but the man kept following. He was now coming closer, and his demeanor was noticeably more aggressive. I could see his expression more clearly now. His face was twisted in an unsettling grin. It was as if he was enjoying the fear he was causing. I whispered to Mike that we needed to find a way out of the woods quickly. We decided to take a different trail, hoping to lose him in the dense underbrush. As we veered off the main path, we heard the man shouting behind us, calling out in a way that made my blood run cold. He was angry and seemed determined to catch us. We pushed ourselves harder, dodging through the trees and jumping over fallen logs. Every now and then, we hear his footsteps getting closer, and the fear made us run faster. I felt a rush of panic. The thought of being trapped in the woods with someone so aggressive was terrifying. At one point, we came to a narrow, steep ravine. We had no choice but to climb down carefully. As we were descending, we heard the man's voice getting closer. He was shouting, and his words were becoming more frantic. It was clear he was right behind us, and I was terrified that he would catch up before we could find a way out. We finally made it to the bottom of the ravine and scrambled up the other side, desperately trying to find the trailhead. Our energy was waning, but we kept pushing forward. The sound of the man's shouts gradually faded as we reached the main trail again. We kept running until we saw a group of hikers coming towards us. We flagged them down and told them what had happened. The other hikers helped us contact park rangers. We were taken to a ranger station where we explained everything in detail. They assured us that they would search the area and look for the man. The rangers were concerned but also determined to help us. We finally made it back to our car, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. A few months ago, I decided to take a solo hiking trip in a remote forest area I had read about. I was looking for some peace and a chance to clear my head. Everything started off well. The trail was beautiful, the weather was clear, and I was enjoying the solitude. I had planned to spend 2 days in the woods, camping overnight. By midday, I had hiked several miles and decided to take a break. I found a small clearing near a stream and set up my tent. I ate lunch and relaxed for a bit. The forest was quiet, and I felt completely at ease. After a while, I packed up and continued on my way. It was late afternoon when I noticed a man walking towards me on the trail. He was alone, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. He looked disheveled but not threatening at first. As he got closer, he greeted me and introduced himself as Greg. He said he was out here for a few days, too, and was looking for a specific spot that he had trouble finding. He seemed friendly enough, and I offered him some water. He thanked me and started asking questions about my hike. I told him about my plans and the route I had taken so far. That's when he started suggesting that I should follow him to a more secluded area nearby. He said it was a great spot for camping and that he could show me the way. I was initially open to the idea but felt uneasy. The way he spoke about the area seemed a bit off. He mentioned that it was a bit of a secret spot and that only a few people knew about it. I told him I was content with where I was and preferred to stay on my current path. Craig's demeanor changed immediately. His friendly smile faded, and his voice grew colder. He started insisting that I come with him. He said it was really important for me to see this place, and it was too good to pass up. His insistence made me uncomfortable. I started feeling like I was being pressured, and that's when I realized something was wrong. I told him again that I was fine where I was and had no interest in changing my plans. That's when Greg's attitude shifted from persuasive to hostile. His face hardened, and he took a step closer to me. He said something like, "You don't understand, it's not just a suggestion. You should come with me." Panic started setting in. I could tell that he was no longer trying to be friendly. I made an excuse about needing to finish my hike and quickly started packing up my gear. I could feel Craig's eyes on me, watching my every move. I tried to stay calm and act normal, but inside I was terrified. Craig started to argue, raising his voice and demanding that I follow him. He even tried to grab my arm. I jerked away and told him to leave me alone. My heart was racing as I hurriedly finished packing my things. Craig's aggression was growing, and I was afraid of what he might do if I didn't get away soon. I decided to take a different path, hoping to lose him. I started walking quickly, taking turns and following less traveled trails. I could hear Craig's footsteps behind me, getting closer. His shouts echoed through the trees, and the sound of his voice made my skin crawl. I felt like I was being hunted. I kept pushing myself, not daring to look back. The forest seemed endless, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to stay safe. My legs were burning, and I was running on adrenaline, but I couldn't slow down. Eventually, I saw a sign indicating that I was nearing a more popular part of the trail. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, hoping to find other hikers or a ranger station. As I approached a clearing where I could see other people, I finally heard Craig's voice trailing off in the distance. I made it to a group of hikers who were taking a break. I quickly explained what had happened, and they offered to help. They contacted park rangers, who then set out to search for Craig. I stayed with the group, feeling relieved but still shaken by the encounter. The rangers eventually found Craig. He was detained and questioned about his behavior. I was later told that he had been known for similar incidents in the past. I was grateful that he didn't manage to force me into a more dangerous situation. After the ordeal, I decided to cut my trip short and head back to civilization. The experience left me on edge, and I realized how quickly things could have gone terribly wrong. My friends and I decided to go camping for a weekend getaway. We picked a spot in a remote part of the national park, far from the usual tourist trails. It was supposed to be a relaxing break from our busy lives. We arrived at our campsite on Friday evening, set up our tents, and made a campfire. It was a beautiful night, clear skies and a gentle breeze. We roasted marshmallows and talked about old times. Everything felt perfect until around midnight when we heard voices in the distance. At first, we thought it was just other campers. The park is big, but it's not uncommon to hear people talking late into the night. The voices grew louder, and we realized they were coming closer. We didn't think much of it, assuming they were just out for a walk. But then we heard them laughing and shouting, and it sounded like they were getting nearer. By the time the voices were almost at our campsite, we felt uneasy. We had heard of people causing trouble in the park, but we didn't expect it to happen to us. We decided to stay quiet and hope they would pass by without noticing us. The voices stopped right outside our campsite. We could hear footsteps moving around, and then one of the men called out, "Hey, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." The tone was casual, but there was something off about it. We hesitated but decided it was best to be polite. We called back, saying we were just camping and didn't want any trouble. The man didn't respond immediately, but we heard murmuring and more footsteps. Then, suddenly, there were several people standing at the edge of our camp. They were a group of men, probably in their late 20s or early 30s, and they were not dressed for hiking or camping. They looked like they had been hanging out in town, not the woods. One of the men, who seemed to be the leader, said, "We heard you were here alone. We just want to make sure everything's all right. Mind if we hang out for a while?" We told them we were fine and wanted to enjoy our own space. The leader seemed to accept this for a moment, but then he said, "Well, it's late, and it's not safe for you to be alone out here. How about you come with us? We've got a safer place not too far from here. We were all uncomfortable with the idea. It was clear they weren't just being friendly. We firmly said no, and that we had planned to stay put. The men exchanged glances, and that's when things started to get tense. The leader's tone turned more aggressive. Look, it's not a request. It's better if you come with us. You don't want to stay here alone. His eyes were cold, and I could see the other men starting to move closer to our tents. Panic set in. We realized they weren't going to take no for an answer. We decided to call the police, but when we reached for our phones, we noticed that the signal was gone. It was as if they were blocking our access to help. One of my friends, Jake, tried to reason with them. He said, "We don't need your help. We're fine here. Please just leave us alone." But the leader's expression didn't change. He looked more menacing now. The men started making threats. "You're not in a position to argue. We're here, and you're coming with us." They began to move closer to the tents, and we could see that they were carrying knives and tools that made us nervous. Desperation kicked in. We decided to grab our things and try to find another way out. We quickly packed up our essentials and planned to leave through the back of our campsite, hoping they wouldn't see us. As we moved quietly through the trees, we heard them talking and arguing among themselves. We followed a narrow path, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The moonlight barely illuminated the trail, making it hard to see. Just as we thought we were making progress, we heard a loud shout from behind us. One of the men had spotted us. The shouting turned into a chase. We ran faster, stumbling over roots and branches. My heart was pounding, and I could hear the men getting closer. We reached a small clearing and saw headlights in the distance. We ran towards the lights, hoping it was someone who could help us. It was a park ranger's truck. We waved frantically, and the ranger stopped, quickly realizing we were in trouble. We told the ranger everything that happened, and he called for backup. The ranger led us to a safe spot while the backup team went to confront the men. We could see their flashlights moving through the trees, and we hoped they would find the men and prevent them from causing any more trouble. After what felt like hours, the ranger came back and assured us that the men had been detained. We were finally safe. The ranger helped us pack up and escorted us back to our car. We left the campsite and decided to head home. The experience left us all shaken, and we couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated. We were thankful for the ranger's help and relieved to be out of danger. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable we were. It's a terrifying reminder of how important it is to trust your instincts and be aware of your surroundings, especially when you're alone in the woods. I thought I was going on a peaceful solo camping trip in the woods. Just a couple of days to unwind, clear my head, and disconnect from work. I chose a spot deep in the forest, away from the usual hiking trails, hoping for solitude and some quiet time. I set up my tent and made a small fire. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a strange smell in the air. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but I figured it was just some old leaves or maybe a dead animal. I ignored it and focused on enjoying the evening. The next morning, the smell was stronger. It was so bad I couldn't stay in the tent. I decided to go for a hike to get away from it. I picked a trail that seemed to head away from the smell and deeper into the woods. The further I went, the worse the smell became. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing and saw something that made my stomach churn. There were scattered bones and bits of clothing among the underbrush. I wasn't a forensic expert, but it was clear these were human remains. I froze. My first thought was to get out of there immediately and call the authorities. But then, I noticed something even more disturbing. Some of the bones still had scraps of skin on them, like they had been left here recently. I started to back away slowly, but my heart was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around but saw nothing. The forest felt unnervingly silent. I retraced my steps back to my campsite, trying to stay calm. My mind was racing, and I felt like I was being followed. I arrived at my tent and found that my gear had been tampered with. My backpack was open, and some of my supplies were missing. It wasn't just an unsettling coincidence, it felt like someone was trying to scare me, or worse, they knew I had found something. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I tried to think clearly. I needed to get out, but I didn't want to leave my campsite and walk into a trap. I decided to stay put and hope that someone would come looking for me. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert. Every sound seemed amplified. I heard snapping branches and rustling leaves but saw nothing. As night fell, the shadows in the woods seemed to close in around me. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually won. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps around my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling my camp. I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. I saw dark shapes moving through the trees, but it was too dark to make out any details. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, praying whoever was out there wouldn't see me. The footsteps stopped, and I heard muffled voices. They were talking, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. My fear was mounting. I needed to get out, but I had no idea how many people were out there or where they were. I waited until the voices faded. When I felt it was safe, I crept out of the tent and started gathering what was left of my supplies. I was moving as quickly and quietly as I could, but the fear of being caught was overwhelming. As I packed, I heard a twig snap nearby. I froze, my heart pounding. I looked up and saw a flashlight beam cutting through the trees. It was moving toward my campsite. I threw the rest of my gear into my backpack and decided to make a run for it. I took a deep breath, turned off my flashlight, and started moving through the woods as quietly as possible. The forest was pitch black, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. Every so often, I heard the distant sound of voices and footsteps behind me. It felt like they were getting closer. I pushed myself harder, determined to reach the park's boundary and find safety. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the lights of a nearby ranger station through the trees. I burst through the forest and ran up to the station, shouting for help. The rangers were shocked to see me and quickly called for backup. They took me inside, and I explained everything I had seen and heard. The rangers organized a search and rescue operation to find the remains and investigate the area. They promised to keep me safe and assured me that they would find whoever was responsible. I stayed at the ranger station until it was safe to leave. The rangers later told me they had found the area I described and were able to identify the remains. They also found evidence that confirmed my fears, signs that a group of people had been operating in the area, hiding from the authorities. I was shaken but relieved to be safe. I had been looking forward to my camping trip for weeks. I needed some time away from the hustle of daily life and thought a quiet weekend in the woods would be perfect. I chose a remote spot I found on an old map, a place far from the usual camping grounds, thinking it would offer me the solitude I craved. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent, made a small campfire, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal. I felt content, the kind of quiet that lets you truly relax. I put my ID, wallet, and phone in a secure spot inside my tent before heading to bed. I woke up the next morning to the sound of rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. When I got up, I noticed the tent was slightly open. I thought I must have not zipped it up all the way the night before. It didn't occur to me that someone might have been tampering with it. I made coffee and sat by the fire, enjoying the fresh morning air. As I was unpacking my gear to make breakfast, I realized something was wrong. My ID and wallet were missing. Panic set in immediately. My phone was also gone, which made things even worse. I checked the area around my tent for any sign of the missing items, but they were nowhere to be found. I felt a sinking dread in my stomach as I realized that whoever took my stuff could still be around. I was alone, with no way to call for help. I decided to walk to a nearby ranger station, hoping to find someone who could help me. The trail to the station was supposed to be about a half-hour walk, but I had no idea how far it was. The thought of someone having taken my belongings and potentially knowing I was alone in the woods made the situation even scarier. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to stay calm and keep a steady pace, but my heart was racing. The forest, once calming, now felt suffocating. After what seemed like forever, I finally reached the ranger station, only to find it empty. The door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone around. I banged on the door and shouted, but there was no response. I was becoming increasingly desperate. I noticed a small phone on the outside of the building, used for emergency calls. I tried to use it, but it was broken. My sense of isolation grew stronger. I felt like I was trapped, with no way to get in touch with anyone. With no other options, I decided to return to my campsite. I hoped that maybe I had overlooked my belongings, or that someone might show up who could help me. The thought of spending another night alone without any means of calling for help was terrifying. When I got back to the campsite, I was relieved to find my tent still intact. It seemed like no one had been there since I left. I searched the area once more, but my ID and wallet were still missing. I realized that whoever took them had likely left by now, but the fear that they might return lingered. I tried to make the best of the situation. I gathered some firewood and made another small fire. I knew I had to stay alert and keep my wits about me. With no phone, my only way to signal for help was the smoke from my fire, but I wasn't sure if anyone would see it. As night fell, the forest became even more oppressive. The darkness seemed to press in on me, and every sound seemed amplified. I stayed by the fire, hoping that someone would notice the smoke or come by to check on me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps approaching. I was frozen with fear. I grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, aiming it toward the noise. I saw a figure emerging from the trees. My heart pounded as I tried to make out who it was. The figure turned out to be a hiker who had been passing through. He looked as relieved to see me as I was to see him. He had a phone with him and offered to call for help. I gave him the details of my situation, and he made the call. Shortly afterward, a search and rescue team arrived. They checked my campsite and the surrounding area but didn't find any sign of the person who had taken my belongings. They were able to take me to a nearby town where I could get a new ID and report the theft. The whole experience was deeply unsettling. I felt vulnerable and exposed in a way I had never experienced before. I had set out for a solo camping trip deep in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote spot that I thought would be perfect for some quiet reflection. The campsite was miles away from the nearest trailhead, tucked away in a dense part of the forest where few people ventured. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and enjoyed a simple meal cooked over the campfire. Everything seemed perfect. I made sure to store my food properly and filled up my water bottles from a nearby stream. I always boiled the water to be safe, and everything seemed to be in order. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard some faint noises outside. It wasn't unusual for animals to be around, so I didn't think much of it. I tried to ignore the sounds and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling unusually thirsty. I reached for my water bottle and took a big gulp. Almost immediately, my stomach felt unsettled. I brushed it off as maybe just a little too much coffee the day before and decided to go for a hike to get some fresh air. While hiking, I began to feel worse. My stomach was churning, and I had a headache. I thought it was just a bug, but the symptoms kept getting worse. I went back to my campsite and saw my water bottles. One of them was lying on its side, and the cap was off. I must have forgotten to screw it on properly, I thought. I poured myself a fresh drink from the bottle, but this time it tasted strange. There was a weird, almost chemical aftertaste that made me hesitate. I took a small sip and felt a rush of nausea. That's when I started to really worry. I checked the other bottle and noticed it was also open, with the water level much lower than it should have been. My stomach was now in knots, and my anxiety shot up. I took a closer look at the bottle and saw tiny flecks of something floating in the water. It was then that the horrifying realization dawned on me. Someone had tampered with my water. My first thought was to find out who could have done this and why. I searched the area around my campsite but found nothing unusual. My backpack and gear were untouched. I felt a growing sense of dread. I was alone, with no phone reception, and someone was clearly trying to harm me. My immediate priority was to get as far away from the campsite as I could. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to gather my belongings. I knew I needed to leave before whoever did this came back. As I was packing, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure moving through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding. I quickly ducked behind a large boulder and watched as the figure moved closer to my campsite. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was a man. I waited until he was out of sight before I quickly finished packing. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I managed to get everything together and started making my way back toward the trailhead, keeping a sharp lookout for any sign of a man. The forest, once a serene escape, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. I was exhausted and scared, but I knew I had to keep moving. My stomach was still unsettled, and I felt weak, but I pressed on. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing behind me, but I never saw anyone. The sense of being watched was unbearable, and I began to worry that I might not make it out of the woods safely. Hours later, I finally reached the trailhead. My legs were trembling, and I felt on the verge of collapse. I flagged down a passing hiker and explained my situation. He was kind enough to give me a ride to the nearest town where I could call for help and get medical attention. At the town, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They took a report and sent a team to investigate the area. I didn't stick around to hear the outcome. I was too shaken and needed to get home. I'd been studying wildlife in a remote forest for weeks. My work involved tracking animal movements and documenting their habits. It was a lonely job, but I loved being in nature, far from the noise of the city. I had set up my base camp in a secluded part of the forest, where the trees were thick and the silence was almost complete. One afternoon, as I was reviewing some footage from my trail cameras, I noticed something odd. There were several large vehicles parked in a clearing about a mile from my camp. It was unusual to see so many cars out here. I assumed it was some local campers or hunters, but it struck me as a little suspicious. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out, taking only my camera and a notebook. I was careful not to make too much noise as I approached the clearing. The vehicles were parked haphazardly, and I noticed that some had their windows covered with dark fabric. That was odd. I crept closer and saw a group of men unloading what looked like hunting equipment. They had several large crates, which they were stacking carefully. My heart started to race. I recognized the gear from my studies. It was used for illegal poaching. These people were hunting protected animals. I took out my camera to document the scene. I wasn't sure how to handle this, but I knew I needed evidence. I was just about to take a photo when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around and saw one of the men from the group staring right at me. His face was hardened, and his eyes were cold. Before I could react, he shouted something to the others. The entire group turned and began to move toward me. My instincts told me to run, but I was frozen in fear. I managed to turn and start moving away, but the men were already closing in. I sprinted back toward my camp, my mind racing. I could hear the men yelling behind me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I made it back to my tent and grabbed my phone. It had no signal out here, but I hoped I could at least get some distance before they caught up with me. As I packed up my things in a frenzy, I heard the men's voices getting closer. They were searching for me, their shouts echoing through the forest. I had to find a way to escape. I decided to leave my camp behind and head toward a nearby river I had mapped out. The dense forest would slow them down, and I hoped the river might offer a way to lose them. I ran through the underbrush, ducking low to avoid being seen. After what felt like hours of running, I reached the river. I could hear the men crashing through the woods behind me, getting louder with each passing second. I waded into the water, hoping the sound of the river would cover my footsteps and the current might help mask my scent. I followed the riverbank, moving quickly but carefully. The water was cold, and the rocks were slippery, but I pushed through. I could see the faint light of dusk starting to settle in, and I hoped I could find a place to hide before it got completely dark. Eventually, I found a small cave along the riverbank. It was well hidden and offered some shelter. I crouched inside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the men calling out to each other, but their voices were fainter now. They hadn't found me yet. I waited in the cave for what felt like hours. The darkness settled around me, and the sounds of the forest began to calm. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I knew I couldn't stay in the cave forever. I had to find a way to get help. As soon as it was light enough to see, I ventured out of the cave. I carefully made my way back to where I had parked my car. The thought of getting back to civilization and reporting what I had seen was a relief. When I finally reached my car, I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I reported the poaching operation and everything I had witnessed. The rangers took me seriously and assured me they would investigate the area. Last fall, I went on a solo retreat in the woods of Maine. I needed a break from work and life in general. I found this cabin online, secluded and surrounded by trees. It sounded perfect. I packed my things and drove up there, excited to have some peace and quiet. The first few days were great. I hiked, read books, and just enjoyed being away from everything. The air was crisp, and the colors of the leaves were beautiful. It felt like I was in another world. I didn't see anyone else around, which was exactly what I wanted. One morning, I decided to take a longer hike. I packed some snacks and water and headed out. I walked for hours, losing myself in the beauty of the forest. As the sun started to set, I realized I should head back. I took a different path, hoping it would lead me back to the cabin faster. That's when I stumbled upon them. At first, I heard voices and the sound of something heavy being dragged. I crept closer, staying hidden behind the trees. I saw a group of men, maybe 5 or 6, dressed in camouflage. They were dragging a deer, but something looked off. They were using these weird traps, brutal and illegal from what I could tell. I stepped on a twig, and the sound was loud in the quiet woods. One of the men looked up and saw me. My heart pounded as I turned and ran. I could hear them shouting behind me, and the sound of their boots crashing through the underbrush. I ran blindly, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I could still hear them, getting closer. Panic set in. I spotted a small cave and dove inside, pressing myself against the cold, damp wall. I held my breath as I heard them approach. They were cursing and arguing about which way I went. One of them said something about not letting me get away, that I'd seen too much. They searched for what felt like forever, but eventually, their voices faded. I stayed hidden until I was sure they were gone. My mind raced with fear. I had to get back to the cabin, but I was lost. I waited until it was completely dark, then crept out of the cave. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to use the stars to navigate, but it was no use. I was disoriented and terrified. I walked for hours, jumping at every sound. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw the faint glow of my cabin's lights through the trees. Relief washed over me as I stumbled towards it. Inside, I locked the door and closed all the curtains. My hands were shaking as I tried to think. I needed to call for help, but there was no cell service out here. I had to wait until morning to drive to town. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump. At dawn, I packed my things as quickly as I could. I got in my car and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror the whole time. The drive to town felt like it took forever, but I finally reached a place with cell service and called the authorities. I told them everything. They said they'd send someone to investigate, but I don't know if they ever did. I didn't stick around to find out. I went home and tried to put the whole thing behind me. Even now, months later, I can't shake the fear. I keep thinking about those men and their traps, and what could have happened if they caught me. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. The peace and quiet I wanted so badly turned into a nightmare I can't forget. I went camping in the Black Hills of South Dakota for a little peace and quiet. I found a nice spot in a clearing, set up my tent, and got a fire going. The forest was calm, and I felt relaxed, ready for a good night under the stars. As evening turned to night, I heard the distant hum of ATV engines. It was annoying but not too close, so I tried to ignore it. After an hour or so, the noise got louder. I saw the lights of the ATVs approaching my camp. 4 riders pulled up, their engines loud and their laughter even louder. I felt uneasy but tried to stay calm. They stopped near my tent, and one of them, a tall guy with a bandana, got off his ATV and walked over. He looked at me, sizing me up. "Nice spot you got here," he said, smirking. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound friendly. "Just here for a quiet weekend." The others joined him, their eyes scanning my gear. One of them kicked at my tent peg, laughing. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. They weren't just being noisy, they were looking for trouble. "Got any beer?" another one asked, a big guy with a leather jacket. "No, I didn't bring any," I lied. I had a couple in my cooler, but I didn't want to give them any reason to stick around. "Too bad," the tall guy said. "Guess we'll just hang out here for a while then." He sat on a rock near my fire, making himself at home. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. If I told them to leave, they might get angry. If I did nothing, they might decide to stay and cause more trouble. They talked loudly among themselves, making crude jokes and comments. Every now and then, one of them would glance my way, grinning. I pretended to be busy with my fire, but my mind was racing, trying to think of a way to get them to leave without escalating things. After a while, the big guy got up and started rummaging through my stuff. "Hey!" I shouted, unable to stay quiet any longer. "Leave my gear alone." He looked at me, surprised that I'd spoken up, then laughed. "We're just having a look," he said, throwing my backpack to the ground. I felt anger rising but tried to keep it in check. "Please, just leave my stuff alone," I said, my voice shaking. The tall guy stood up and walked over to me, getting in my face. "You got a problem?" he asked, his eyes cold. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just want to be left alone." He stared at me for a moment, then turned back to his friends. "Let's go," he said, much to my surprise. "This place is boring anyway." Relief washed over me as they got back on their ATVs. But just as they were about to leave, the big guy grabbed a stick from the fire and threw it at my tent, setting it ablaze. They roared with laughter as they sped off into the night. I quickly grabbed my water bottle and tried to put out the fire, but the tent was already ruined. I managed to stop it from spreading, but my gear was a mess. I felt a mix of relief and anger. They were gone, but they'd left me in a bad spot. I spent the next hour cleaning up the mess and salvaging what I could. The forest was silent again, but the peace I'd felt earlier was shattered. I kept looking around, worried they might come back. I decided it wasn't safe to stay there. I packed up what was left of my gear and started hiking back to my car. The darkness and the sounds of the forest felt more threatening now. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I finally reached my car just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. I threw my stuff in the back and got in, locking the doors. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ATVs behind me. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my statement and promised to look into it. I don't know if they ever found those guys, but I knew I wouldn't be camping alone in the Black Hills again. I decided to take a solo trip to the Ozarks for some peace and quiet. I needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my camera. I drove deep into the woods, far away from any towns or people, and found a spot to set up camp. It was beautiful, so quiet I could hear the wind in the trees and the rustle of animals in the underbrush. The first day was perfect. I hiked, took photos, and enjoyed the solitude. As evening came, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The night was dark, with only the stars and my fire for light. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being alone in the woods. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed some water and snacks and set off on a trail that seemed to go deeper into the forest. After a couple of hours, I came across a small, overgrown path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it. The path led to a clearing with an old, run-down cabin. It looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the wood weathered and gray. But there was something about it that didn't feel right. I thought about turning back, but my curiosity was stronger. I walked closer, trying to get a better look. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from behind the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. A man emerged from the trees, dirty and disheveled. He looked like he hadn't seen another person in years. His eyes were wild, and he was holding a shotgun. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice rough and angry. I was just hiking," I stammered, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to intrude." "This is my land," he said, stepping closer. "You have no right to be here." "I'm sorry," I said, backing away. "I'll leave now." But he didn't seem to hear me. He raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I heard a shot, the sound echoing through the trees. I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees all looking the same. I could still hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, shouting. I stumbled, falling to the ground. My ankle throbbed, but I forced myself to get up and keep moving. I found a small ravine and slid down into it, hiding behind a large rock. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I heard him above, cursing and shouting. He fired the shotgun again, the sound deafening. I pressed myself against the rock, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I waited, not daring to move. When I was sure he was gone, I climbed out of the ravine and started back the way I had come. I was limping, my ankle swollen and painful, but I didn't stop. I had to get back to my camp, to my car. It took me hours to find my way back. The sun was setting by the time I reached my campsite. I grabbed my things, threw them in the car, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization. I went to the nearest police station and told them what had happened. They took my statement and said they would investigate, but I don't know if they ever found him. I still think about that day, about how close I came to not making it out of those woods. Now, whenever I go hiking, I make sure to stay on marked trails and never go alone. I decided to camp alone in the Smoky Mountains. I wanted some time away from everything, a break from the noise and the stress. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or other campers. It was perfect, just me and nature. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked dinner. The sounds of the forest were comforting, and I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to explore. I hiked all day, taking in the beauty of the mountains, the fresh air, and the solitude. When I returned to my campsite, something felt off. My tent was unzipped, and my supplies were scattered. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but then I noticed footprints. Human footprints. My heart started to race. I checked my belongings and found that some food and a flashlight were missing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker who needed some supplies. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to stay alert and keep my campfire going all night. As darkness fell, the forest seemed different. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the sound. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed, then hours, but the footsteps didn't return. The next day, I decided to pack up and leave. As I gathered my things, I felt eyes on me. I looked around, but saw no one. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I started hiking back towards my car, keeping a fast pace. After a few hours, I realized I was lost. I had been so distracted by the feeling of being watched that I must have taken a wrong turn. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to set up camp again. I found a small clearing and quickly pitched my tent. I made a small fire and sat close to it, trying to stay calm. As night fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I kept my flashlight and a small knife close by, ready for anything. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, circling my campsite. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, catching a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there, watching me. I shouted, telling them to leave me alone, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and stepped out of my tent. The firelight cast eerie shadows, making it hard to see. I scanned the darkness, my heart racing. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A man, dressed in dirty clothes, with a wild look in his eyes. He stared at me, not moving. I shouted again, telling him to leave, but he just stood there, watching. I backed towards my tent, keeping the flashlight on him. He took a step forward, then another. I knew I had to act. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it at him. He stopped, his eyes widening. For a moment, we stood there, locked in a standoff. Then he turned and ran into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, not sure what to do. I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and started hiking, not caring which direction, just needing to get away. I walked through the night, not stopping until the first light of dawn. Exhausted, I finally found a trail and followed it. Hours later, I stumbled upon a ranger station. I told them everything. They took my report and promised to investigate. I left the mountains that day, vowing never to camp alone again. The feeling of being watched still haunts me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm just grateful I made it out alive. I've always loved photography, especially capturing the raw beauty of nature. So when I got the chance to explore the Everglades, I was ecstatic. It was just me, my camera, and the endless expanse of marshes and mangroves stretching out before me. I spent the day snapping photos of everything, the wildlife, the vegetation, the serene waters reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. The Everglades were breathtakingly beautiful, a photographer's paradise. As dusk settled in, I decided to find a good spot for some nighttime shots. I ventured deeper into the wilderness, following a narrow trail that wound through the dense foliage. The air was thick with the sounds of chirping insects and the occasional splash of water. That's when I saw them, figures moving in the shadows, far off the beaten path. At first, I thought they were just other explorers like me, perhaps fellow photographers. But as I zoomed in with my camera lens, I realized they were up to something else entirely. The group seemed tense, huddled around large crates and duffel bags. They weren't carrying tripods or cameras. Instead, they had tools and equipment that looked suspiciously out of place in the tranquil Everglades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I snapped a few shots, intending to document what I was witnessing. But in my excitement, I must have made a noise, a twig snapping underfoot, perhaps. Suddenly, the group froze, heads snapping in my direction. I knew immediately that I had been spotted. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted back down the trail. Adrenaline fueled my legs as I ran, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind me. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me up, but I didn't dare slow down. Through the darkness, I could hear their voices, harsh whispers, urging each other to catch me. Fear clawed at my chest, urging me to run faster, to escape the men who were now hunting me through the Everglades. I took sharp turns, hoping to lose them in the labyrinthine paths of the swamp. But they were relentless, their footsteps growing closer with every passing second. I glanced back once and saw their silhouettes against the dim moonlight, closing in. With a surge of desperation, I veered off the trail, crashing through the thick underbrush. Thorns tore at my clothes, mud sucked at my shoes, but I kept pushing forward, driven by sheer terror. I had to get away, had to find somewhere safe to hide until help arrived. Heart pounding, breath ragged, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It offered no shelter, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving, listening for any sign of my pursuers. The night was silent except for the sounds of the swamp, insects buzzing, water lapping against the reeds. I couldn't risk staying in the open. Pushing through the fear, I plunged into the murky waters of a shallow creek, wading upstream to throw off my scent. The cold water numbed my legs, but I pressed on, driven by the fear of being caught by the men chasing me. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged onto a muddy bank and collapsed behind a fallen tree. I strained to listen for any sounds of pursuit, but the only thing I heard was the pounding of my own heart. Had I managed to evade them, or were they closing in? Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. I dared not move, not even to check my surroundings. The adrenaline that had fueled my flight now left me trembling and exhausted. But I knew I couldn't rest yet. I had to find my way out of the Everglades, back to safety. Carefully, cautiously, I crept along the edge of the creek, using the moonlight to guide me. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, every splash of water made my heart skip a beat. I was alone, vulnerable, hunted. Finally, I stumbled upon a familiar trail marker. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down yet. I pushed forward, ignoring the ache in my muscles and the exhaustion weighing me down. When I reached the edge of the Everglades, I practically collapsed onto solid ground. Tears stung my eyes as I fumbled for my phone, dialing emergency services. The authorities arrived swiftly, and I led them back to where I had last seen the smugglers. But by then, the group was gone, leaving behind only their makeshift camp and the crates that hinted at their illicit activities. The authorities assured me they would investigate, but the terror of that night lingered long after I left the Everglades. I never went back to photograph the Everglades again. I decided to go camping in the Appalachian Mountains to clear my head. I needed some time away from everything, just me and nature. I packed my gear and drove up to a trail I knew was pretty isolated. It was perfect for what I needed, peace and quiet. The first day was great. I hiked up the trail, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of the forest. I found a good spot to set up my tent near a small stream. As the sun started to set, I made a fire and cooked some dinner. It was calm and relaxing, just what I wanted. The next day, I decided to explore a bit off the beaten path. I was curious about what was deeper in the woods. After a couple of hours of walking, I noticed something strange. The trees were cut down in a small area, and there were tire tracks leading further into the forest. It seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it at first. I kept walking, following the tracks out of curiosity. After a while, I saw a clearing up ahead. As I got closer, I realized what it was: a large marijuana plantation. Plants were everywhere, carefully cultivated and hidden from casual hikers. I knew this wasn't something I should be near. Before I could turn back, I heard voices. They were close. I ducked behind a bush and peered through the leaves. I saw two men with guns patrolling the area. My heart started racing. These guys didn't look like they were messing around. I knew I had to get out of there without being seen. I slowly backed away, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every twig snap and rustle of leaves sounded deafening. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them coming after me. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I just wanted to get back to my campsite and pack up. As I moved, I suddenly tripped over a root and fell hard, making a loud noise. I froze, listening. The voices got louder. They heard me. Panic set in. I scrambled to my feet and started running. I could hear them shouting behind me, getting closer. I zigzagged through the trees, trying to lose them. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but I kept going. I couldn't let them catch me. The thought of what they might do if they did was terrifying. I glanced back and saw one of the men not far behind, his gun ready. I pushed myself harder, desperate to get away. I spotted a rocky area up ahead and ran towards it, hoping to find a place to hide. I squeezed between two large boulders and held my breath. I could hear them searching nearby, their voices angry and tense. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the voices started to fade. They were moving away, still looking for me but not as close. I waited a bit longer before slowly crawling out from my hiding spot. I needed to get back to my campsite and get out of there. I moved carefully, trying to avoid making any noise. It took a while, but I finally made it back. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I knew I had to leave before they decided to come back this way. With my backpack on, I started down the trail, moving as fast as I could without running. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. The fear was overwhelming. I just wanted to get to my car and drive far away from there. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the trailhead. My car was still there. I quickly threw my stuff in the back and got in, locking the doors. My hands were trembling as I started the engine and drove away. I didn't look back. As I drove down the mountain, I couldn't shake the fear. The image of those armed men was burned into my mind. I knew I had been lucky to get away. When I reached a small town, I stopped and called the authorities to report what I had found. They thanked me and said they would investigate. I kept driving until I reached home. The whole experience felt surreal, like a bad dream. But it was real, and it was terrifying. I knew I would think twice before going off the beaten path again. It was supposed to be a routine research trip, just me and my equipment trekking through the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountains. I had always been fascinated by the untouched wilderness, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. Little did I know, this trip would lead me into a nightmare. The first few days were peaceful. I mapped out the area, collected samples, and documented the flora and fauna. The silence of the mountains was soothing, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of leaves. But on the third night, things took a dark turn. I was sitting by my campfire, reviewing my notes when I heard distant noises echoing through the trees. At first, I thought it might be wildlife or the wind, but as the sounds grew louder, I realized it was something else entirely. Low voices, gruff and urgent. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the source of the noise. Through the dense foliage, I spotted them, men in heavy boots, their faces hidden under dirt-streaked hats. They were huddled around makeshift mining equipment, digging into the earth with purpose. My heart raced as I realized what I had stumbled upon: illegal mining operations in the heart of the Rockies. I knew I had to document this, to report it to the authorities. But before I could retreat to safety, a twig snapped under my foot. The men turned as one, their eyes locking onto me with suspicion and hostility. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They muttered to each other, their voices carrying a dangerous edge. I was exposed, caught red-handed in their secret operation. One of them stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice rough like gravel. I tried to explain that I was conducting research, that I hadn't meant to intrude. But my words fell on deaf ears. They saw me as a threat, someone who could expose their illegal activities to the authorities. Fear gripped me as I realized the danger I was in. Another man, larger and more intimidating, took a step closer. "She's seen too much," he muttered to the others. "We can't let her leave." Panic surged through me as they advanced, their intentions clear. I turned and ran, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Branches clawed at my clothes, roots threatened to trip me, but I pushed forward, driven by sheer terror. Behind me, I could hear their heavy footsteps, closing in. I knew I couldn't outrun them forever. Desperate, I veered off the trail, plunging into the dense underbrush. Twigs snapped underfoot, leaves whipped against my face, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed behind a fallen tree. I held my breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. Minutes passed like hours, but the forest remained eerily silent. Carefully, I peeked out from my hiding spot. There was no sign of the men, but I knew I couldn't stay there indefinitely. I had to find a way out, back to civilization where I could call for help. Using my compass and what little daylight remained, I navigated through the unfamiliar terrain. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Fear gnawed at me, urging me to move faster, to get away from the danger lurking in the shadows. Hours passed before I finally emerged onto a familiar trail. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I pushed on, ignoring the ache in my muscles and the fatigue weighing down on me. At long last, I reached the ranger station where I had parked my car. I practically threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. My hand shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing emergency services. When the authorities arrived, I led them back to the site of the illegal mining operation. But by then, the men were long gone, leaving behind only traces of their activities. The authorities assured me they would investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. For weeks afterward, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid that those men would find me again. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the nightmare I had escaped. The tranquility of the Rockies had been shattered, replaced by a lingering sense of dread. I never returned to those mountains, haunted by the memories of that terrifying encounter. The beauty of the wilderness had been tainted by the darkness lurking beneath its surface. I was deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, studying rare plants for my research project. I'd been out there for weeks, camping and hiking through dense woods. The isolation was peaceful, the only sounds being birds and the rustling of leaves. I loved it out there, feeling like I was the only person in the world. One morning, I set off to a new area I hadn't explored yet. My map showed it as a dense patch of forest, likely to have the rare species I was looking for. It was a long hike, but I didn't mind. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of wildflowers. Hours passed as I carefully collected samples and took notes. As the day wore on, I noticed signs of recent human activity. Fresh tire tracks and broken branches made me uneasy. I hadn't seen anyone else for days and wasn't expecting company. I pushed on, hoping it was just some off-roaders passing through. I was wrong. I heard the sound of chainsaws in the distance, cutting through the silence. My heart sank. Illegal loggers were the last thing I wanted to encounter. I knew they could be dangerous, not wanting anyone to interfere with their operations. I decided to avoid them and take a longer route back to my camp. But fate wasn't on my side. I stumbled upon a clearing where several men were cutting down trees. They spotted me before I could back away. I froze, trying to think of what to say. One of the men, a big guy with a scar across his face, shouted at me to stop. The others turned to look, their expressions hostile. He approached me, asking who I was and what I was doing there. I tried to explain that I was just a botanist, studying plants for my research. But he didn't believe me. He accused me of being a government agent, there to spy on them and shut down their operation. I tried to deny it, but he wasn't listening. The other men surrounded me, their eyes filled with suspicion and anger. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew I was in serious trouble. They started arguing about what to do with me. Some wanted to let me go, but others thought I'd report them. The scar-faced guy seemed to be in charge, and he wasn't convinced by my pleas. They decided to take me to their camp deeper in the forest. They tied my hands and marched me through the woods, my mind racing with fear. I knew I had to find a way to escape, but I didn't know how. They were armed with axes and chainsaws, and I had nothing. At their camp, they threw me into a small, makeshift hut and locked the door. I could hear them talking outside, discussing what to do with me. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make out their plans. They were worried I'd bring the authorities down on them, and some were suggesting getting rid of me for good. I had to act fast. I looked around the hut for anything I could use to free myself. My hands were tied, but not too tightly. I managed to wriggle one hand free and untie the ropes. There was a small window at the back of the hut, just big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed out, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest was dark, the sun having set while I was their prisoner. I moved slowly, avoiding the campfire's light and staying in the shadows. I could hear them laughing and talking, unaware that I was escaping. My heart raced as I crept away, every twig snapping underfoot making me flinch. I knew I couldn't go back to my camp. They'd find me there. I needed to get to the nearest town and find help. I remembered the direction I came from and started moving as quickly as I could through the dense forest. My legs ached, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Hours passed, and I kept moving, my fear driving me forward. I stumbled and fell several times, but I got back up and kept going. The forest seemed endless, and I felt like I was running in circles. But then I saw lights in the distance, the faint glow of a town. Relief washed over me as I staggered towards the lights. I burst out of the forest onto a road, waving frantically at the first car I saw. The driver stopped, and I explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a rush. They took me to the local sheriff's office, where I finally felt safe. I told the authorities everything, and they organized a search party to find the loggers. I never found out what happened to them, but I was just glad to be alive. My research project was put on hold, and I left the Pacific Northwest, the memory of that terrifying encounter forever etched in my mind. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now held a darker meaning for me. I was in Virginia for a project, researching old Civil War battlefields. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, just me and my camera, documenting locations for a historical book. I drove out to a spot deep in the wilderness, far from any main roads. It was peaceful, just the sounds of nature and the history I was there to capture. I parked my car on the side of a narrow dirt road and hiked in, carrying my equipment. The trees were thick, and the underbrush was dense. I followed an old, overgrown path that led to a clearing. The clearing was supposed to be a site of an old encampment. I set up my camera and started taking pictures, noting the layout of the land and imagining what it must have been like back then. After a while, I heard voices. At first, I thought maybe it was other history enthusiasts, but the tone was different. I moved closer to the sound, staying hidden behind the trees. I saw a group of men, dressed in camouflage and carrying rifles. They were gathered around a makeshift camp, talking and moving with a sense of purpose. My stomach dropped when I realized this wasn't a historical reenactment. These men were real and looked dangerous. I stayed as quiet as I could, watching them. They had maps and diagrams spread out on a table, and they were discussing plans. It was clear they were practicing for something big. I took a few steps back, trying to retreat without being noticed. That's when I stepped on a branch, the snap echoing in the still air. The men's heads snapped up, and one of them shouted. Panic set in. I turned and ran, hearing them behind me. My heart pounded as I crashed through the underbrush, branches slapping my face and arms. I didn't dare look back. I knew if they caught me, it wouldn't end well. I tripped over a root and fell hard, but scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward. I could hear them shouting and cursing, closing in. I spotted a fallen tree with a hollow space underneath and dove in, pressing myself into the damp earth. I covered myself with leaves and tried to slow my breathing. They were so close I could hear their footsteps and see their boots through the gaps in the foliage. They searched the area, their voices angry and frustrated. One of them said they couldn't let me leave, that I knew too much. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on, their voices fading. I stayed hidden, too scared to move. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out and looked around. The forest was silent again, but I knew they were still out there somewhere. I had to get back to my car. I moved as quietly as I could, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the paths. Every sound made me jump, convinced they were right behind me. I finally saw the road and my car. Relief washed over me as I sprinted the last few yards. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police station and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those men would come after me. I drove back to my hotel, packed my things, and left Virginia that same night. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away. We've been planning the camping trip for months. Me, Josh, Emily, and Sarah. The Catskills sounded perfect, peaceful, and away from everything. We loaded up the car and set off early Friday morning, excited for a weekend of hiking and campfires. The drive was long but beautiful, winding roads through dense forests. We reached our campsite in the late afternoon, and the sun was just starting to set behind the trees. Setting up camp was fun. Josh struggled with the tent while Emily and Sarah laughed and tried to help. I started a fire, and soon we had everything ready. As the sky darkened, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It felt great to be out there, away from the noise of the city. Around midnight, we heard a rustling in the bushes. We all froze, staring into the darkness. Josh grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the noise. A raccoon darted out, and we all laughed, relieved it wasn't anything worse. We decided to call it a night and headed into our tents. I fell asleep almost instantly, tired from the day's activities. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud snap. It sounded like a branch breaking, but closer. I sat up, listening. There it was again, followed by a low, grumbling voice. My heart started to race. I unzipped the tent quietly and peeked outside. In the dim moonlight, I saw a shadow moving near the edge of our campsite. It looked like a man. I crawled out of the tent, trying not to make a sound. Josh stirred and woke up, whispering, "What's going on?" I motioned for him to be quiet and pointed towards the shadow. We both watched as the figure moved closer, now clearly a man with a long beard and wild hair. He was muttering to himself, looking around like he was searching for something. Josh and I stayed low, hoping he wouldn't see us. The man walked around the campsite, poking our gear and mumbling. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but he sounded angry. After a few minutes, he walked off into the woods. We waited, tense, until we were sure he was gone. Then we quietly woke Emily and Sarah, explaining what we saw. None of us could sleep after that. We sat by the fire, keeping it low, and talked about what to do. Emily suggested packing up and leaving, but it was pitch dark, and navigating the trails would be dangerous. We decided to stay put and leave at first light. We took turns keeping watch, but the night passed without any more incidents. At dawn, we quickly packed up our things and started hiking back to the car. The forest felt different, more menacing. Every sound made us jump. We were about halfway back when Sarah screamed. We turned to see her foot caught in a snare, a simple but painful trap that yanked her leg up into the air. Josh and I rushed to free her, while Emily kept watch. We managed to get Sarah free, but she was hurt and couldn't walk properly. Josh and I took turns supporting her as we continued. Our pace was slow, and we were all on edge. We hadn't gone much further when we found another trap, this one a pit covered with leaves and branches. It was clear now that someone was trying to catch us. Panic set in. We knew we had to move faster, but Sarah was slowing us down. Emily found a sturdy branch, and we used it as a makeshift crutch for her. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was too quiet, the birds and animals seemingly gone. Then we heard it, the same grumbling voice from the night before, closer this time. We ducked behind a large rock, peering out to see the bearded man again. He was walking along the trail, inspecting his traps. He looked furious, kicking at the dirt and shouting to himself. We waited until he moved past us before continuing. Our progress was slow, and every step felt like a gamble. We were constantly scanning for more traps and listening for the man. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the edge of the forest and saw the car. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. The man was there, standing by the car, his eyes wild and angry. We froze, unsure of what to do. He saw us and started shouting, accusing us of trying to steal from him. Josh tried to reason with him, but the man wasn't listening. He pulled out a knife and started towards us. We backed away, trying to think of a way out. Just then, a ranger's truck appeared on the road. The man hesitated, giving us a chance to run. The ranger saw what was happening and stopped, jumping out of his truck with his hand on his gun. He shouted for the man to drop the knife. The man looked at us, then back at the ranger, before finally dropping the knife and raising his hands. The ranger called for backup and took the man into custody. We explained what had happened, and he assured us we were safe now. It turned out the man was a survivalist who had been living in the woods for years, paranoid and convinced everyone was out to get him. He'd set traps to protect his territory, not realizing how dangerous they were. We drove back to the city in silence, still shaken from the ordeal. The trip that was supposed to be a fun getaway had turned into a nightmare. We decided to take a family camping trip to the Redwoods in California. It was just me, my wife, and our 2 kids. We thought it would be a good way to spend some quality time together, away from the city and all the noise. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, and told stories around the campfire. The kids loved it. The trees were massive, and everything felt peaceful. But on the 3rd night, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I first heard the noises. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard voices. Low, whispering voices. I got out of the tent to take a look. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling that someone was watching us was overwhelming. The next morning, I found footprints around our campsite. They were too big to be from any of us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just other campers passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I wanted to make sure I could see if anyone approached. Around 2 a.m., I heard the voices again, closer this time. I quietly got out of the tent and grabbed the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but I still couldn't see anyone. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, and there they were. 3 men, dirty and wild-eyed, standing just outside the circle of light. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew right away these weren't ordinary campers. One of them stepped forward and smiled. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said, but there was nothing friendly about his tone. I didn't know what to do. My wife and kids were still sleeping, and I didn't want to scare them, but I knew I had to do something. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just looking for a place to stay," the man replied. "Mind if we join you?" I knew this wasn't a request. I shook my head. "I think it's best if you move along. We're just here with our kids, trying to have a quiet trip." The man's smile faded. "Oh, we insist," he said, stepping closer. The other 2 men spread out, flanking me. I glanced back at the tent. My wife was peeking out, her eyes wide with fear. I knew I had to protect them. "You need to leave, now," I said, louder this time. The man's face twisted in anger. "I don't think you understand," he said. "We're not going anywhere." One of the other men lunged at me, but I managed to dodge and push him away. "Wake up the kids and get to the car," I shouted to my wife. She scrambled to wake the kids while I tried to hold off the men. They were stronger than me, and I could feel my strength fading. But I had to buy them time. I heard my wife scream as she bundled the kids into the car. I took a punch to the gut and doubled over, but I didn't let go of my flashlight. I swung it wildly, hitting one of the men in the face. He fell back, cursing. "Go! Go!" I yelled, stumbling towards the car. The men were right behind me. I could hear their footsteps, their heavy breathing. We managed to get into the car and lock the doors just as they reached us. My wife fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The men pounded on the windows, shouting and threatening us. Finally, the engine roared to life. We sped out of the campsite, the men chasing us for a few yards before giving up. My wife drove as fast as she could, not stopping until we reached a small town several miles away. We went straight to the police. They took our statement and told us there had been reports of escaped convicts in the area. They assured us they would search the woods, but I knew I'd never feel safe camping again. That night, in the safety of a motel room, I held my family close. We were lucky to be alive. I decided to take a solo trip to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. I needed some time alone, away from everything. I heard it was beautiful and quiet, the perfect place to clear my mind. I loaded up my canoe, packed my gear, and paddled out deep into the wilderness. The first few days were great. I didn't see another soul, just me and the water and the trees. I set up camp on a little island, made a fire, and enjoyed the solitude. I spent my days fishing and exploring, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. On the fourth day, I noticed something strange. As I was paddling back to my camp, I saw another canoe in the distance. It was unusual because I hadn't seen anyone else around. The canoe was heading towards a part of the shore I hadn't explored yet. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured someone else was enjoying the peace and quiet. That night, I heard noises. Voices, low and serious, tarrying over the water. I got up and looked around, but couldn't see anything in the dark. It made me uneasy, but I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just other campers. Still, I kept my knife close, just in case. The next day, I decided to check out where I saw the canoe heading. It was a bit of a paddle, but I was curious. As I got closer, I saw signs of activity. Footprints in the mud, discarded food wrappers, and the remains of a fire. It looked like someone had been camping there recently. As I was looking around, I heard the voices again. They were closer this time. I quickly hid behind some bushes and watched as 3 men came into view. They were carrying large bags and talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they didn't look like your average campers. I waited until they were out of sight before sneaking back to my canoe. My heart was pounding. Something about those men didn't sit right with me. I paddled back to my camp as quickly as I could, trying to keep a low profile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, every snap of a twig making me jump. Around midnight, I saw a light moving through the trees on the shore. It was them. They were searching for something or someone. Panic set in. What if they found me? I stayed as quiet as possible, barely daring to breathe. The light moved closer, then further away. Eventually, it disappeared. I didn't sleep at all, just sat there clutching my knife, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I decided I needed to leave. This wasn't the peaceful trip I'd planned. I packed up my gear and got ready to go. As I was loading my canoe, I saw them again, watching from the shore. They knew I was there. I pushed off quickly and started paddling away, but they jumped into their canoe and followed. My mind raced. Why were they after me? What did they want? I paddled as hard as I could, but they were gaining on me. I spotted a narrow channel and headed for it, hoping to lose them in the twists and turns. The channel was shallow and filled with rocks, making it difficult to navigate. I scraped the bottom of my canoe several times, but I couldn't slow down. I could hear them behind me, their voices angry and close. I pushed harder, my arms burning with the effort. Finally, I saw a small inlet and made for it. I beached my canoe and ran into the woods, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I hid in the underbrush, trying to control my breathing. They were close now, shouting and cursing. I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, their voices started to fade. I waited until I was sure they were gone before moving. I made my way through the woods, keeping off the main paths. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. Eventually, I found a small ranger station. I stumbled in, exhausted and scared. The ranger looked at me, shocked at my appearance. I told him everything. He called for backup, and soon the place was swarming with law enforcement. They took my statement and went out looking for the men. I stayed at the station, too shaken to do anything else. They found signs of the men, evidence of their drug operation, but the men themselves had disappeared. The officers told me I was lucky to be alive. They said the Boundary Waters were known for this kind of activity, though it rarely reached the tourists. I left Minnesota the next day, vowing never to return. The peace I'd sought turned into a nightmare I couldn't forget. I was in the Adirondacks for a week, documenting wildlife. My days were spent hiking through dense forests, capturing photos of birds and other animals. The area was beautiful but remote, and I rarely saw other people. On the fourth day, I set up camp near a small clearing. It was a peaceful spot, with a stream nearby and plenty of trees for shade. That evening, as I was reviewing the day's photos, I heard the distant sound of chainsaws. It was odd because I hadn't seen any logging operations in the area. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out the next morning. I woke up early and followed the sound, moving cautiously through the forest. After an hour of walking, I came across a group of men cutting down trees. They weren't wearing any uniforms or badges, which struck me as strange. I took a few photos from a distance, not wanting to get too close. As I was about to leave, one of the men spotted me. He yelled something to the others, and they all stopped what they were doing to stare at me. My heart raced as I quickly turned and walked away, trying to look casual. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I made my way back to camp, hoping they would just ignore me. But that evening, I heard footsteps approaching. I peeked out of my tent and saw 3 of the loggers coming towards me. They looked angry. One of them, a tall man with a beard, called out to me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm just taking photos of the wildlife," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Show us the camera," he said. Reluctantly, I handed over my camera. They scrolled through the photos, and their expressions darkened when they saw the pictures of them logging. The tall man smashed my camera against a rock, breaking it into pieces. "You shouldn't have taken those," he said, stepping closer. "We don't need any trouble." "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, backing away. "I'll leave right now." But they didn't seem convinced. They circled around me, blocking my way. Panic set in as I realized I was in serious danger. I had to think fast. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I lied. If something happens to me, no one will find out. The tall man frowned, but he didn't move. Another man, shorter with a scar on his cheek, looked at him and said, "We can't risk it. She's seen too much." My mind raced as I tried to come up with a plan. I glanced around, looking for any chance to escape. Then I noticed a narrow path leading into the trees. Without thinking, I bolted towards it, running as fast as I could. They shouted and chased after me. Branches scratched my face and arms as I ran, but I didn't stop. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps pounding on the forest floor. I reached a steep hill and slid down, nearly losing my balance. At the bottom, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. I ran inside and hid behind a pile of rotting wood, trying to catch my breath. The loggers arrived moments later. They spread out, searching the area. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they would hear it. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, they finally gave up and left. I waited until I was sure they were gone before creeping out of my hiding spot. My body ached from the tension and the scrapes from my frantic run. I made my way back to camp, grabbed what little gear I could carry, and set off in the opposite direction of the loggers. I walked through the night, not stopping until I reached a small town the next morning. I went straight to the local authorities and reported what had happened. They seemed skeptical at first but agreed to investigate. I stayed in town for a few days, recovering from the ordeal and hoping for news. A few days later, I heard that the authorities had found the illegal logging operation and shut it down. The men were arrested, and I was asked to testify. It was a terrifying experience, but I was relieved that justice was served. I've since returned to my wildlife photography, but I'm much more cautious now,